Good morning. On behalf of the Washington State Insurance Commissioner Mike Kreidler, I'd like to welcome you to Climate Summit 2021. Washington State and its public and private institutions are leaders on climate change, including the areas of research, business best practices, policy, and regulation. Today during Climate Summit 2021, you'll have the opportunity to hear from our experts in these three key areas: climate change science, private sector best practices, and the insurance and climate change nexus. Our goal is to focus our discussions on what we can do to mitigate and adapt. I'm pleased to introduce our host, Commissioner Mike Kreidler. Commissioner Kreidler is the longest-serving insurance commissioner in the nation. He led the National Association of Insurance Commissioners Climate Risk and Resilience Work Group starting in 2007 and led the charge for insurers to disclose how they're preparing for the potential risks associated with climate change. Commissioner Kreidler joined the Paris Pledge for Action in 2015 and the United Nations Environment Sustainable Insurance Forum in 2016 to bring international awareness to the issue of climate risk and insurance. Welcome, Commissioner Kreidler.
Welcome to Climate Summit 2021. We have assembled a group of outstanding speakers for you today. You will hear from climate leaders representing private and public sectors, academia, and insurance industry. Each of these leaders is taking up the mantle to lead the way on mitigating risks posed by climate change. I want to give special thanks to our keynote speakers, Washington State Governor Jay Inslee and IDF Secretary General Ekhosuehi Iyahen. Governor Inslee will talk about the ways Washington State is leading the way to mitigate climate change. Secretary General will discuss international efforts to address insurance protection gap. We will also hear from Rob Johnson with the Climate Pledge Arena about building the world's most sustainable arena. The arena and Seattle's new NHL team, the Kraken, will make their debut this month. This year, we partnered with our state school superintendents to raise awareness of climate impacts for our high school students by sharing the summit with them. Thank you for joining us for Climate Summit 2021, and let's get started.
Thank you, Commissioner Kreidler. Next, Washington State's first Indigenous Poet Laureate Rena Priest is here to welcome our audience to today's event. Ms. Priest will recite two of her powerful poems about Washington State's beloved sea creatures as she sets the stage for Climate Summit 2021. Welcome, Ms. Priest.
Eggsbuchil, o helix and quinus natachalatia caius, sahweltana, snat, chochlamisan. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 2021 Annual Climate Summit. To open up today's events, I'll share two poems, one about keystone species, our salmon, the salmon of the Salish Sea, and one about an indicator species, southern resident orcas. So the first one is called Songs on the Salmon Scale. Both of these poems are written in pantoum form, and you'll hear repeating lines throughout. So, Songs on the Salmon Scale. A salmon is a song sung in rounds, a series of concentric circles like a raindrop in the sea, rippling out and returning. A series of concentric circles, a chorus and a verse, rippling out and returning in a shining body of treasure. A chorus and a verse, a hero home from adventure in a shining body of treasure bearing gifts from the deep. A hero home from adventure like a raindrop on the sea bearing gifts from the deep. A salmon is a song sung in rounds. And the partner poem about orcas is called Silence from the Deep. How do we mistake desolation for peace? When orcas no longer sing, will we grieve? Waves say hush along the beach. Under the waves, there is no reprieve. When orcas no longer sing, will we grieve? Each generation dwindles in number. Under the waves, there is no reprieve from human noise, pollution, hunger. Each generation dwindles in number. The world is a mirror of our hearts. Look away from human noise, pollution, hunger. Everything is endangered or going extinct. The world is a mirror of our hearts. Look away so as not to see how under the waves everything is endangered or going extinct. When orcas no longer sing, will we see how under the waves that say hush along the beach. When orcas no longer sing, will we see how we mistook desolation for peace?
Thank you, Ms. Priest. Joining us now is the Governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee. Governor Inslee is a fifth-generation Washingtonian. He's lived and worked in urban and rural communities, which is why he understands the urgency to protect all corners of the state from climate disaster. Today, Governor Inslee will break down how his administration is fighting climate change head-on. Welcome, Governor Inslee.
Hi, Governor Jay Inslee here. I'd like to say hello, and I'd like to start by thanking Washington's Poet Laureate, Rena Priest, for opening today's summit. It's inspiring. I'd also really like to thank Mike Kreidler and his office for hosting today's climate summit. Mike's been a great leader on a host of things, including climate. You know, we know climate change can be disastrous for the world we know. That existential uncertainty is causing real problems in our economy as well. And this crowd knows the immense risk to insurers and policy holders going forward. I was in the Met Tower yesterday talking to Sun Mountain Lodge, who had millions of dollars of losses from smoke damage from a fire. We know what we're up against. So I want to thank Mike for his many years of work on climate issues at the state and national level. He joined the Paris Pledge for Action in 2015 and the United Nations Environment Program Sustainable Insurance Forum in 2016. And this is the Commissioner's fifth climate summit, bringing together climate scientists, thought leaders, policymakers, and the insurance industry. I know students are watching this today, and I want you to know there is so much you will be able to do in this fight going forward. The work we're doing certainly will involve you and your futures and your future families and grandchildren. And it is going to take a multi-generational effort to save the world. And Washingtonians are at the vanguard of this effort, as we always are. We've established the best laws in the country to cap and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, get to 100% clean electricity, and address environmental justice for the communities most impacted by air pollution and climate change. And we're going to keep pushing. We are pursuing strategic investments in electric vehicle infrastructure and transit, in getting carbon pollution out of our buildings and transitioning off of natural gas, in leveraging our lands as natural climate solutions to repair our climate by pulling carbon pollution out of the atmosphere. And we're siting the clean energy facilities of the future in Washington. And we're investing in making our communities greener and more resilient. And we are creating thousands of jobs in the process. I went to the opening of our first electric bus manufacturing plant in Ferndale, Washington a while back. We're building the world's first commercial all-electric airplane in Arlington. I just walked out of a meeting of a potential company doing some renewable energy work to hiring thousands of people in our state. So that's good news. But this industry is important. With the U.S. insurance industry representing 3% of GDP and holding $8 trillion in investments, you have the opportunity to influence how we get more of the economy on track to an emissions-free future. Insurance companies can help sound the alarm in ways that inspire action. And as an industry on the front lines of the costs of climate change, you are so well positioned to make the essential point that the cost of inaction on climate change is far greater than the cost of taking action to save our future. And beyond what you say, your actions, through the investments you make and the conditions being placed on those insured, we know can encourage the individuals and companies you insure to be prudent and to upgrade their assets to greener, more fuel-efficient, low-carbon solutions. Now, as the world scientists warn that we've reached code red on climate change, there's never been a more important time for the insurance industry to keep up this critical work, to keep leveraging financial investments and insurance products, to get businesses, utilities, and institutions to move more quickly to net zero, and to keep using the industry's platform to lift up the need for deep, rapid decarbonization of our economy. I want to thank everyone who's been speaking today and everyone who appreciates the urgent need to find solutions to the biggest threat facing humanity in this or any generation. And I want to ask you to be leaders. Look, you don't have to be a governor or president or senator to be a leader. Everybody within the sound of my voice can be a real leader here, and we have a tremendous opportunity to rescue our communities from this dire threat. So let's do this together. I know we can meet this challenge. Be well.
Thank you, Governor Inslee. Next, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Ekhosuehi Iyahen, the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum. The Forum is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry and supported by the World Bank and the United Nations. The aim is to enhance the use of insurance to build greater resilience against disasters. The Secretary General will address the insurance protection gap. Welcome, Secretary General.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Commissioner Kreidler, for the invitation to be part of the 2021 Climate Summit. It's certainly a pleasure to be here this afternoon for this event. So today I'm going to be focused on, I will be speaking on the specific theme of addressing the protection gap. And I will use the time to focus on four main things. The first being share a little bit of information with you on the Insurance Development Forum and its purpose. Secondly, I will then offer a few reflections on the protection gap and why it's so relevant at this time, particularly given what we are seeing across the world with disasters and also the recent release of the IPCC report. Third, I will also share a little bit of insight in terms of what we're seeing as it relates to innovative ideas emerging in terms of how insurance can help to address this protection gap. And then finally, offer some thoughts and reflections, which I hope can inform some of the subsequent discussions and exchanges that we can have. So with that, the Insurance Development Forum is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry, but supported by international organizations. It was first announced at the UNFCCC COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015, but officially launched in 2016 by the insurance industry and co-chaired by the World Bank as well as the United Nations. Our aim is to optimize and extend the use of insurance and related risk management capabilities to build resilience and protection for people, businesses, communities, from disasters and economic shocks. Currently, we have 5 working groups that really speak, I believe, to the core areas that we should be focused on when we think about the protection gap and the needs that are out there. The first being on risk modeling and really working as a public sector and the private sector working together to improve the availability of risk information and risk insights. Our second area of focus is on law, regulation, and resilience policies, which I know will resonate with this community. And we have 2 working groups that are focused on really designing new solutions. And this is a sovereign and humanitarian working group, as well as an inclusive insurance working group. And then finally, thinking about insurers on both sides of the balance sheets, not only in terms of their underwriting capacity, but also on the investment side, really thinking about how we can increase the investments that insurers are making in terms of in infrastructure, particularly in emerging markets. And so we have over 200 experts working actively over these 5 working groups to help to address, again, this overarching problem that we see as it relates to the protection gap. The second slide in my presentation just gives you an overview of the members of the IDF. So you will see not only the large insurance and reinsurance companies and brokers, but also very much a public sector presence within the IDF. So for example, the German government sits on our steering committee, as well as I mentioned earlier, the United Nations, UNDP, the World Bank, and others. So getting to the heart of the conversation that we are here to have today, which is the protection, focus on the protection gap, and obviously how that converges with climate change. I think that most of us are very well familiar with some of the big figures that are often referenced when we think about the protection gap. And in this slide, you see the figure of 162.5 billion. And this is an assessment from Lloyd's of the size of the global insurance protection gap in emerging economies. This also sits against the backdrop where we have 1%, just 1% of natural disaster losses in developing countries between the period of 1980 to 2004 being insured. And this is quite a stark difference when you compare it to most developed markets where we're talking about usually losses. You have 30% being covered by insurance. And again, another important, I think, element of the work that we do and a reflection on this theme is that a lot of the losses that we are seeing in terms of climate and disasters, most of that is simply not insured in many developing countries. So the protection gap, when we think about it, is an issue in developing countries, but I think that, again, it's also an issue that we see in many developed countries as well. And what is particularly concerning is the fact that oftentimes those people who actually need the most protection are often the ones who are not able to access insurance. And so for us, this, I think, is one of the pressing issues that we need to really reflect on when we think about the impacts of climate change, but also how our world has sought to deal with the impact of COVID-19. The next slide is just to give you a little bit more context when we think about the protection gap and the absence, I would say, of insurance in many of these communities and the context within which that occurs. So for many developing countries, when you do have a disaster, there is usually a need for some kind of humanitarian financing support. And that's some financing from international donors to help to support response and recovery efforts. But the challenge that we see is that the humanitarian or the global humanitarian system is actually significantly underfunded. So what that means is that when you do have these disasters, the system is quite, I think, difficult to mobilize the resources that are actually needed for those communities that have been impacted. So oftentimes what happens is that individuals, poor people have to absorb these shocks. So it means quite a significant impact in terms of loss of lives, but also loss of livelihoods. And so what we essentially have is a situation where there is a mismatch between the commitment to protect and actually the availability of financing to support interventions. There was a study which was done recently by the Center for Disaster Protection. And one of the most revealing elements of that study was that just 2% of global funding was planned and arranged in advance in terms of the COVID-19 response. So I think that really sheds quite a remarkable light on the kinds of deficiencies that we are seeing when we think about the availability of ex-ante instruments to support governments, people who have to deal with these shocks on an increasingly more regular basis. Another element of this is also the challenge of looking at infrastructure investments that are being made in many of these countries. Infrastructure obviously is an essential ingredient for the success of a modern economy, has positive impacts in terms of output, productivity, and just fundamental for long-term growth. And a lot of these governments are actually investing significant resources in terms of infrastructure, both at the sovereign and sub-sovereign level. But what we're also seeing is that there is an increasing need to think about how are we actually protecting these investments that we are making in terms of infrastructure, because they're so critical for our long-term development objectives. And this is particularly challenging because whilst they're making these investments, there are also significant threats when we think about disasters that could occur and the rollbacks that actually would be incurred as a result of damage to critical infrastructural investments. So this for us is actually quite a big issue when we start to engage many of our governments around the question of the protection gap, and looking at the investments that they're making in infrastructure and the need for a greater resilience and protection for those investments. So in thinking about this problem, what is clear is that insurance has an important role to play. But it is not only about insurance, it's also about the broader risk management solutions that are actually needed. But insurance can actually be quite an important contributor in terms of helping to address or bring to the fore the solutions that are required. Because when we think about it, there is a need for better information, a need to improve availability of information and understanding of the risks that governments or people and communities, businesses, etc., actually face. And this is so fundamental and germane to the insurance industry. And so there's an opportunity there for industry and basic fundamentals that exist within the industry to bring greater transparency to these risks. Another area that I think is quite important that insurance can play a critical role when we think about the protection gap is also in driving prevention and risk reduction. When we have a better understanding of what the risks are, there's also an opportunity to have more robust conversations around the investments that we're making in risk reduction and risk mitigation activities. And similarly for disaster response and how we structure that. And then fundamentally, there's also the value of insurance in terms of just making financing available to people once they have been affected by a disaster. So there are a multiplicity of fronts in which the value proposition of insurance can really be, or is especially relevant at this time when we think about climate and some of the more complex risks that are emerging. And so what we're seeing on the global front is actually the issue of the protection gap, but also the role of insurance really rising on the global agenda, the global climate agenda, and just the global development agenda. And so one of the things that has been quite interesting over the past year that has emerged is, for example, the G7 earlier this year in their communique made very specific reference again to the need to increase the availability of ex-ante financing. And as part of that, to actually have a more proactive exploration in terms of how do we increase the availability of insurance protection, particularly for those who are who need it the most. And so I think that that was quite an incredible development when you think about the G7 communique releasing such a statement. In addition to that, we also have seen the vulnerable group of 20 countries. These are a collective of the most vulnerable countries in the world, releasing a communique again in July, which spoke very clearly to the protection gap and the need to really start to work more proactively with industry, public and private sector to improve the availability of risk and resilience information, but fundamentally to start to develop new solutions that are needed. And then finally, we also have the emergence of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership, which is a partnership between the V20, the G7, and the G20 countries, really focused on extending and making available insurance coverage and risk management solutions to 500 million people by 2025. So I think that that gives a clear steer in terms of the importance of this conversation at this time, given what governments are having to contend with. At the same time, we're also seeing quite a bit of innovation in this space. Right now, there's been, I think, quite interesting developments in terms of risk pools, leveraging parametric insurance solutions, for example, in the Caribbean, where you have the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, where you have governments pooling their risk into a single portfolio to access insurance markets at more competitive rates, and also leveraging the parametric insurance models. Similar things in Africa with the drought risk pool in the Pacific region. And then also at a national level, many governments really begin to explore this question of parametric insurance, risk pooling kind of solutions, and just insurance generally in terms of deepening resilience. So I hope that these examples provide some steer in terms of the conversations that we can have about what does that mean in the context of more developed economies, the United States, and what are the opportunities to do more on that front. And finally, I would say that I often like to frame this issue of the protection gap and what we need to do, and the need for better and more public-private collaboration between the insurance industry and the public sector as really the opportunity to build more effective risk management systems and also protection systems to deal with the kinds of risks that we have to contend with. And for me, this is actually quite an important challenge for us as a global community, for us as national actors to think about what is required. Because when we think about climate change, it's a global challenge. It presents new risks, complex and interconnected risks. There is a demand for risk management services. There is a demand for the kinds of solutions that insurers can bring to bear. But at the same time, there's also a need to think about the innovation that is probably also required, because for the kinds of risks that we're seeing, it often will require, I think, more robust conversations between the public sector and the industry to design solutions that are appropriate. I think it also warrants some reflection in terms of how do we ensure appropriate regulation to deal with the kinds of products that we are seeing emerging? How do we leverage technology effectively to drive the solutions that are needed for the future? So in concluding, I will just say that one of the big things that I think is going to emerge, or is already emerging, is the need for greater and better partnerships and coalitions that can help us to focus on what the problems are, to bring transparency to these risks, but to also drive the kinds of solutions that are needed that really add value to the broader public financial management processes, but also the individuals, particularly those who are most vulnerable, can provide them with the solutions that are needed. So I will conclude by just saying you can find more on the work of the IDF on our website, which is on this slide. But also we have a number of publications that we have released speaking to a variety of themes which are related to the protection gap. Some of these include a practical guide to insuring public assets, to another publication that's focused on the development impact of risk analytics. And I hope that this also provides, hopefully, more information, food for thought, as we think about the kinds of solutions that are needed when we reflect on climate change and the world that we are faced with, but obviously might have to contend with if we are not able to keep to 1.5 degrees. So I'll stop here, and just again to say thank you, Commissioner Kreidler and the team, for the invitation to really be part of this session today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Secretary General. Here now to examine climate change science and effect is Dr. Amy Snover. Dr. Snover is the director of the Climate Impacts Group and University Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center at the University of Washington. Dr. Snover will be speaking to us about climate risk in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome, Dr. Snover.
Hi, I'm Amy Snover, Director of the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to share with you some of the latest science around climate risk in the Northwest. I want to begin by thanking the Commissioner for the opportunity to speak at this event, and in particular, to thank all of you in the audience who are making time in your busy lives to pay attention to this really important and urgent issue of climate change. Our organization was honored to help partner with the Insurance Commissioner to host his first Climate Risk Summit in 2016, which was held at the University of Washington with about 150 people attending, if I remember correctly. I'd like to begin by introducing organizations I direct so that folks know what kinds of resources we have available in the Northwest for addressing climate impacts and climate resilience. The University of Washington Climate Impacts Group has been working since 1995 to build climate resilience across the region by advancing awareness and understanding of climate risks, and to work closely with folks to apply this information as they act to shape our region's future. We are also the proud hosts of 2 federal programs of cross-regional collaboration, also designed to build climate resilience: the USGS-funded Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and the NOAA-funded Northwest Climate Resilience Collaborative. So in my talk today, I want to think a little bit about where we are now on our climate change journey, what's new from some of the recent science reports and observations, and a little bit of reflections on what the road ahead of us. Because of centuries of greenhouse gas emissions and emission rates that are accelerating over time, we're living in a world that's committed to significant climate change, disruption, loss, and damage. There is no doubt that we've changed Earth's climate through our activities, and with consequences for a broad range of aspects for the atmosphere, oceans, snow, ice, Earth's fauna, ecosystems, and all of us who live on this planet. We're on track to emit enough greenhouse gases to dangerously interfere with the Earth's climate system by the 2030s. We've already caused a little over 1 degree Celsius or around 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. And we're on track to exceed the internationally agreed warming thresholds of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius if we don't get off the track we're on. Current estimates are for the end of the century, if we continue emitting serious amounts of greenhouse gases, to experience from 1 to 5.7 degrees Celsius, or roughly 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit of global warming. The really important thing to realize is that we will keep causing more warming until we reduce the global net amount of greenhouse gases that we emit each year to 0. Put more simply, until we stop emitting greenhouse gases, we will keep causing more warming and more warming and more warming. And so therefore, stabilizing temperatures at any level requires us to reduce emissions to net 0. We know a lot about the consequences of the warming that we've already caused and the warming that's to come if we don't reduce emissions now. And they're serious. And that's what I want to spend most of the rest of the talk talking about. So the science on key hazards and consequences of climate change in the world and in the Northwest has been clear for dozens of years. I've been working in this field since the mid-90s, have been given some version of this talk since then. And let me tell you, we know a lot, and we know a lot of detail, and we have a lot in hand to help us prepare. So we can expect climate change to bring us a significantly different climate here in the Northwest. We expect to see warming in all seasons. We expect more frequent incidences of extreme heat. And overall, we're really going to see ourselves moving outside what we think is normal. So by the 2050s, we expect that annual temperatures will be warmer than what we experienced during the past century. So let me say that again. The average year by the 2050s is going to be hotter than the hottest year of the 20th century. We also expect changes in precipitation, where summers are likely to be drier and falls, winter, and spring are likely to be wetter. We also expect that heavy rain events will become heavier. So for example, the top 1% of our heavy rain events would be 20 or so % more intense late this century. All of this will bring fundamental changes to the water cycle that we depend on and that underlies life in the Northwest. The big change will be the effect of warming on our mountain snowpack. We know we depend on that snowpack for transferring water from the wet season of the winter to the dry season of the summer, holding that water for people and farms and fish to release it when we need it. The challenge is that warming will reduce the snowpack. And so depending on how much we emit, that snowpack is expected to decrease over time. So by the 2040s, we expect that spring snowpack in Washington will be about 45% less than it was in the past century, and about 65% less, or only 1/3 of what we expected in the past by the 2080s. Of course, individual years could be slightly better than that, and also slightly worse because of natural variability, which will also continue to layer on top of climate change. Overall, I would say the changes in the water cycle are making the drier times drier and the wetter times wetter. Or another way of putting it is more water when we don't need it. So increasing risk of floods, larger floods, less water when we do need it, increasing risk of drought, lower stream flows in the summer. We also expect more changes, significant changes in many of the Northwest forests. The National Climate Assessment a couple times ago, the third National Climate Assessment, identified changes, the combined impacts of forest fire, insects, and drought, combining to significantly stress and alter many of our forest ecosystems. Wildfire is on a lot of people's mind, and we expect to see the area burned by wildfire triple in the Columbia River Basin by the 2040s compared to what it was in the 20th century. And we also expect to see quite a few more very high fire danger days. So on average for Washington and Oregon by the 2050s, we'd see 50% more very high fire danger days. Sea level rise has already been observed and is expected to accelerate both globally and right here in the Northwest. So looking at the most recent projections for sea level rise in Washington State for the end of this century compared to the beginning, we expect that sea level will rise at Friday Harbor of around 2 feet, with a range of possibility of 90% chance of 1 to 3.5 feet. Tacoma is about the same, an increase of 2.5 feet. Could be a little less or a little more, depending on the confidence with which you'd like me to tell you that number. All of these things combine in the coastal area to increase risks of inundation, flooding, erosion. All of these changes that I've mentioned also compound to stress our ecosystems, fish, wildlife, habitat, our communities and social systems, and cause a variety of economic costs. In addition to the decades of climate science and climate impact science showing us what changes to expect on the ground, decades of climate impact and risk assessments have shown us what's at risk as a result of these changes in the Northwest. I'll just point out one of them here, which is the fourth National Climate Assessment, which was released in 2018. And the chapter on impacts on the Northwest identified these 5 areas of importance to the region that are most at risk from climate change. They identified our critical infrastructure, electricity, water, transportation systems at risk from hazards due to climate change, changes in temperature, and other effects, changes in demand that are caused by climate change. Climate change is also going to stress our natural resource sectors and economies in the Northwest. These range from forestry, fisheries, agriculture, and the communities dependent on them. Climate change will alter our natural and cultural heritage that underlies so much of what people value and experience here in the Northwest, whether it be tribal values of species or places, or recreational values of hunting and fishing. All of these will be stressed and altered by climate change. I think in this time right now, we all know how stressed our health system is, and climate change will bring increasing stresses through direct impacts on folks, through like heat and floods and other physical hazards, to changes in disease and other impacts from that manifest for people in a variety of different ways. And then really importantly, the climate assessment pointed out the vulnerability of our frontline communities. And in particular in the Northwest, they identified tribes and indigenous peoples, natural resource dependent communities, and economically disadvantaged as on the front lines of climate change. So if you look across the sort of whirlwind tour I just gave of what we've known now for decades, the science, and then I'll talk a little bit more in the future about recent experience, but both of these are clear. Climate change will push on our sore spots, challenging our crucial aspects of Northwest life, economies, and communities, and come on the top of challenges and stress all of those places are currently experiencing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the 6th assessment report of the physical science of climate change. This release had the strongest statement yet about human influence on the climate, stating that human influence on the climate system is now an established fact. This reflects decades of science and assessments, studying how the climate system works, collecting more and more observations about changes around the planet, and basically watching the climate warm as human influence becomes stronger and stronger. So there is no doubt that we have warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that we're seeing the consequences now in numerous ways all around the planet. So people ask, what's new? What's new about this report? And what I would say is that in some regards, it's not new because it's affirming and strengthening previous statements. On the other hand, that's very new because what it is doing is showing us how the evidence is accumulating to enable us to be more strong about what we say. So CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are now at their highest in at least 800,000 years. It's warmed over 1 degree Celsius, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since pre-industrial times. And these changes in Earth's climate have happened everywhere on the globe and are unprecedented in human history. Humans have caused more rain to fall on Earth. Major atmospheric features like mid-latitude storms and the jet stream to move. We've caused glaciers to melt, sea ice to decrease, snow cover across the globe to decrease. We've caused oceans to warm, acidify, and lose oxygen, and sea level to rise. We've caused weather disruptions, meaning that we have changed what it is we should expect in terms of extreme weather events, where heat waves and extremely hot days have become more frequent and intense, and cold extremes have become more rare. We've started to see marine heat waves, which we've caused, which are regions of hot sea temperatures that have become twice as frequent since the 1980s. So climate change is already affecting every inhabited region across the globe. There's more specificity and confidence in the information that's provided in the IPCC and in the information we have available locally. We know that more greenhouse gas emissions will result in more warming. We know that every bit of additional warming brings bigger impacts. And we know that the total amount of warming and total impacts depend on how much we emit. The IPCC is being clearer, more explicit about warnings and more directly expressing urgency. They tell us that the land and ocean's ability to slow climate change by absorbing the CO2 from our emissions is diminishing. They tell us that many changes in our climate are irreversible for centuries to millennia. So even if we stop emitting today, we will see further global warming at rates that depend on how much we emit in the future. In other words, the Earth's climate hasn't quite caught up with all our emissions yet. And they are also very explicit in telling us that the changing climate means we can't base our decisions on what we've experienced in the past, but we have to take into account the scientific calculations for the future because greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time and we haven't stopped emitting them yet. I want to talk now, turn from this conversation mostly about the global science and the global report to give a sense of what's new in our knowledge in the Northwest. And again, I'm really going to focus on the increased specificity of our understanding of what to expect, where, and when, and also talk a little bit about the direct experience we're seeing of relevant consequences. So I'm going to begin with an example about fire risk. We're increasingly understanding how climate change increases the risk of wildfire in the Northwest, and also how that risk differs in different kinds of environments across the Northwest. So in dry forests of central or eastern Washington, for example, fire typically has been frequent, small, kind of low severity, doesn't kill all the trees. Although some of those features have changed as a result of fire suppression. But fire tends to be caused by dry conditions, which are worsened by climate change. And we're seeing some of those worsen with the major fires we're seeing across the Northwest. But there's also good science about how to manage these fires, or how to alleviate the risk of these fires by prescribed burning and thinning. This is very different from what science is showing about climate impacts on fire risk west of the Cascades. In our large, wet forests west of the Cascades, we know that fire risk is driven by different features, that it's driven by dry conditions, ignition, and large east winds. We also know that prescribed burning and thinning is not sufficient, is not actually appropriate for managing this fire risk. And instead, we need to focus on prevention and preparation. So this is just an example of how we're understanding more and more what the local impacts are going to be, how they differ in different places across the region, and how appropriate preparation or response also differs. So this is the kind of information we need to embed in our local risk assessments and planning and decision-making. Another component of what to expect isn't just what the climate's going to do, but who's at risk and where and why. And so we're having increasing awareness in the context of fire of people exposed because they live in the wildland-urban interface. In Washington, about 35% of the housing units are in the WUI. And many of these communities are not adapted to the current wildfire risk, let alone the future. So we know what climate change will bring with this doubling of acres burned in grasslands, 4 times the acreage burned in forests by the 2040s relative to late 20th century. We know we're increasingly exposed and not prepared for current risks. And we're watching fires unfold across the landscape and show us the consequences of that preparedness or lack thereof. We're also having the opportunity to learn from that and see what kinds of treatments work and how communities can come together to increase their resilience and preparedness. Another aspect of wildfire risk, of course, is the increasing risk of smoke events reaching population centers. They've always been a hazard that's folks primarily in the drier parts of our region have experienced, but we've seen these more and more affecting larger populations in urban centers. We're having better understanding of the public health hazards associated with this and the need to increase support for coping options. During the last days of June this year, the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest here in the US and in Canada, experienced temperatures that had never previously been observed when a heat dome, which is a strong high pressure system, basically traps the heat and parks itself over us, happened. So records were broken across the region by huge margins. By a much larger margin than many of the climatologists or other researchers here in the region had ever seen in a heat wave. Canada set a new all-time temperature record of 121 degrees, I think, in the village of Lytton, which was largely destroyed by a wildfire that started shortly afterward. Portland had record high temperature of 116. Seattle reported 3 100-degree days, as many as it did the entire last century. There are many impacts of these, the worst of which were the fatalities. Several hundred people were estimated to have died. There are wildfires, crop failures, transportation system challenges, slowdowns or closing of some of the transit systems in Portland, a long list of challenges across the region. These heat events are the form heat events in general are the form of extreme weather most likely to be affected by climate change. So this particular event was extremely unlikely to have occurred without global warming. Right now, with the amount of warming we've experienced, scientists have estimated that the risk of such an event happening in any year is about 0.1%. As we look forward, if we continue warming and emissions and the globe warms to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the risk would increase for an event like this from 0.1% to 20%. We know that the risks of heat events like this are not evenly distributed. And to make that point, I just want to share maps of the Seattle-King County metro area with a heat mapping project that King County recently did, showing how on hot days, heat is not evenly distributed across the landscape. Some areas are several degrees warmer than other areas, and this reflects actually long-lived patterns of inequities and discrimination in our communities. So we're not evenly exposed, which means we also need to prepare in different ways and provide preparation resources to those areas most at risk. So both at the global scale and right here in the Northwest, we are seeing events happen like our large wildfires, like the heat dome event, that are right along the lines of what we expect from climate change and are in some part or another caused by climate change. We also have a long list of impacts that we can expect to unfold across the region. And building climate resilience means assessing the risks posed to everything we care about and working to reduce those risks. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the resources that are available to support that kind of risk assessment, looking at a local scale about how the climate will change, what the impacts will be on the landscape, so that we can look at our own systems and see what we might be able to improve. This isn't an exhaustive list, but I'm aiming to give you an example of the diversity of information that we have, because it's sometimes easy to get lost in climate change being a huge issue, and it's not easy to remember that we actually have lots of really local specific data that can support decision making. So where are we now? We have decades of science on the impacts of climate change globally, nationally, and right here in the Northwest. We have decades of work by groups like ours and by communities and governments all across the region that help us understand really what's at risk. And we're at a place where more people and organizations are taking climate change seriously than ever before. We're living right now in a world where the human influence globally and locally is becoming increasingly obvious to, I'll call them ordinary people who weren't necessarily paying attention, or to people who thought this might happen, but it was all going to be a long way off. I'm experiencing that with the kinds of inquiries I'm getting, requests to speak, not just to planners or engineers or government officials, but I'm asked to talk in the media about climate impacts on tourism, on outdoor recreation, on urban planning. We've been asked to give talks to marine insurance industries. All of these folks are showing this, they're actually demonstrating how awareness and concern is at a level that I haven't experienced before in my career. And I know that other talk on climate change in the American mind and opinions surveys is also showing that. We also see climate change being taken seriously by the executive orders coming out of the Biden administration, and by many things embedded in a lot of different proposed legislation from Congress. We're seeing climate change being taken seriously in our state by the passage of the Climate Commitment Act and a bunch of other legislation, by this summit and the acts of the insurance commissioner, by our state agencies starting to embed sea level rise information in their capital grant planning. The list goes on. We're seeing this nationally with Moody's, the credit rating agency, signaling bond downgrade possibilities for communities that are unprepared for climate change. We're seeing more action and more concern than I've ever seen before in my career, and we haven't done enough yet. And I say this with sort of three major aspects in mind about where we really need to step up our work. First, the National Climate Assessment stated, and I think many of us have seen this written other places as well, that the scale of adaptation implementation is incommensurate with the projected scale of climate threats. In other words, awareness is at a higher level, risk assessment and planning has happened in many places, but we haven't made that step from planning to action. Climate is embedded in everything, everywhere, but climate thinking isn't yet embedded in everything we do. It's also very clear that despite significant progress at many levels of government in our region and across the country, frontline communities are facing significant climate resilience gaps. Climate change exacerbates and exposes fundamental issues of inequity. We have differential vulnerability and differential impacts of climate risk management activities. I see often that the capacity to respond or adapt or even think about climate impacts is concentrated frequently in wealthier and more urbanized geographies. And we have important resilience gaps that remain for many frontline communities across the region and the country. Finally, we need to do more because we haven't stopped global warming yet. We know that we will exceed the internationally agreed thresholds of 1.5 and 2 degrees C of warming this century, unless we make deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. So there's more to do. We need to implement our adaptation and preparation decisions using this locally specific science about impacts and exposure. We need to attend to the resilience gaps that are facing frontline communities, and we need to reduce and eliminate emissions so that we can stop warming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Snover. How does the public perceive climate change? Here with us today to answer that question is Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz. Dr. Leiserowitz is the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and a senior research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment. He will explain climate change in the American mind. Welcome, Dr. Leiserowitz.
Good day, everyone. My name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I'm the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication at the Yale School of the Environment. And I'm really excited to be with you again for the second year and to give you an update and a little more information than what I provided last year about climate change in the American mind. So just a quick reminder, we study how do Americans and other people around the world respond to the issue of climate change. What do people understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks? So the likelihood and severity of different types of impacts. What kinds of policies do people support or oppose? And then what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in around climate change, which of course increasingly is not just carbon pollution reduction behaviors, but increasingly preparedness and adaptation behavior. Ultimately, as scientists, our question is answering the question, why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, and political reasons why some people get really engaged with this topic, others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, at least here in the United States. So we work all over the world. We've been doing lots of work at the national level, the state level, the local level. But for today, I'm going to really zero in on climate change in the American mind. So let me just remind those who, or introduce those who didn't see me speak last year, that it would be, I'll start with a proposition, that it would be great, it would be wonderful, in fact, if all Americans could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. A full semester course dedicated to understanding here's how the climate system works, Here's what the causes are, the consequences, the solutions, several months worth of instruction on here's what this issue really is and why it's so important. But of course, that's never going to happen, not in a population of over 300 million people. Most people don't have the background, they don't have the training, they don't have the time, they don't have the interest to really get in and understand all those details. So the critical question is, given that the vast majority of people are going to have a limited amount of shelf space devoted in their heads to this issue, what are the core things that people need to understand? Okay. Now, of course, if you're a water resource manager, you need to know lots of additional information, but I'm talking about the general public here. What is it vitally important that people know? And in the course of our work and many of our colleagues around the world, we think we've identified 5 key ideas that we think all people should understand. And moreover, we boiled those 5 key ideas down to just 11 words. And so let me start there. And here we go. The 5 key ideas. Scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. Now that's very simple, but it's deceptively simple. I like to call these meta ideas because, in fact, you can instantiate, you can provide evidence for, you can tell thousands of stories reinforcing each of these critical understandings in your audience's mind. Okay? Here are all the ways that we know that climate change is, in fact, happening on planet Earth today. Here's all the dozens of ways that we know that climate change is being caused by us, by human activities. Okay, of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years of Earth history, but this time it's different. This time it's the direct result of the burning of fossil fuels and land use change around the world. Okay, humans basically dumping carbon pollution into the atmosphere, which is having all kinds of cascading effects. Here are the thousands of ways that it's already harming us right here, right now. And of course, it's going to get much, much worse in the future if we continue on the current path. And then last, but absolutely not least, but there's hope. And this is absolutely critical to begin to communicate because most people don't yet know what we can do about this. That in fact, we have most of the solutions we need already in hand. But people don't know what they can do as individuals. We don't know what we can do as communities, as cities, as states, as the nation, and as the world. So it's really, really important to begin to communicate to people, not just the seriousness of the threat and the risks, which of course is exactly what the insurance industry is all about, is managing and mitigating risk, but also helping us understand how do we mitigate and manage that risk. And so again, I think the insurance community has a particular opportunity to engage your consumers, your constituents, your audiences in understanding and responding effectively to this global crisis. So how are we doing here in the United States? So let me now begin with where Americans are on some of these key ideas. So what you're looking at now is a set of data that we've been collecting for over a dozen years. We do nationally representative surveys that we call Climate Change in the American Mind. 2 surveys every year, every fall, every spring, every fall, every spring, and we have been doing that now for over a dozen years. And what you can see here is that when we started back in the fall of 2008, American opinion was kind of at a high water mark at about 71%. That's on the left-hand side of your screen. But then we saw a 14 percentage point drop from 2008, bottoming out in 2010. Then it was slowly been working its way back up until you can see on the far right, that's our most recent release data as of spring of 2021, that we were at 70% of Americans who understood that it was happening. And it's been right around 72, 73, 72, 70 now for over a year. Now, on the one hand, this is good news because we're finally back up to that high water mark of public understanding. This is even real. But to put that in a context, if we were in Japan, this number would be over 95%. So Americans, unfortunately, still have a ways to go to even understand that this is actually happening. Okay? And you can see here on the bottom part of the chart that 15% of Americans actually say it is not happening. And the other remainder are basically people who say they don't know. Okay? So even on the fundamental question of is this real, Americans still have a ways to go in understanding this issue. But then we look at, do they understand the causes? And here we see that, again, on the far right, 57% as of last March understood that this is mostly human caused. So that is still a lot of room for growth. And in fact, you've got 30% of the country who say that they think it's just natural. And that is a really important misunderstanding, because if in your mind this is just natural cycles, then it's something we just need to weather, we just need to get through, but eventually this will all work its way out, and we don't need to actually change anything. It's only once you understand that this is the direct result of dumping gigatons, billions of tons of carbon pollution into the atmosphere for decades, that have been accumulating into the atmosphere and increasingly warming the planet as a whole with all those cascading effects, that you begin to understand how important it is that we have to take action to reduce that carbon pollution. Okay, and then we look at, do people understand that actually there's a scientific consensus on this? So multiple studies using very different techniques have all converged on the fact that it's at least 97 and probably now up to about 99% of climate scientists are convinced that climate change is happening and human caused. Not what are the impacts on the Indian monsoon going to be in the year 2080, about which there's still a lot of uncertainty, but about the fundamentals. Is this real? And is this human caused? There is no legitimate scientific debate within the scientific community at all. And so what we've seen is that people are increasingly understanding this, this basic fact. And you can see we're at a high water mark at about 57% of people who understand that, but it's only 57%. And moreover, the vast majority of Americans do not understand that that consensus is more than 9 out of 10 scientists. So even this is still a fundamental misunderstanding for many, many people in the United States. And then we look at the question of, are people worried about this? Now, this stands in for a whole bunch of measures of their assessments of the risks of climate change, and I'll show you a couple of those in a bit. But basically, you can see that worry levels have been on the rise over the past decade. And we're at about 64% of Americans who are at least somewhat worried about this issue as of March of 2021. But only 25% say that they're very worried. So why is this? Why don't Americans currently perceive this as a really serious and worrisome threat? Well, for many people, they still think of this as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe some developing countries, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it's psychologically distant. It just becomes one of 100 other issues that's out there, and maybe I kind of wish somebody would do something about it, but I don't see why this is important. I don't see why this is urgent. Okay, so this too remains a key fact. And again, this is right at the heart of the insurance industry, is helping people understand and appreciate the risks that we are, in fact, not just risks, the harms that we are already experiencing, and that we have to be taking action to both protect ourselves as well as reduce them over the longer term. And then, because I know this is on everyone's mind, here's what we found about Americans understanding that global warming is already affecting weather in the United States. Now note, this is from March of this year, and we found that about 6 in 10 Americans think that global warming is affecting weather in the United States, with about 31%, just under a third, who think it's already affecting our weather a lot. Now, this will be one of those measures that'll be very interesting to see how it changes in response to the 5 months since we last asked this question, which have been brutal. Okay, we have seen record-setting heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, and of course, just a record-setting drought across the southwest part of the United States. I mean, just massive, massive impacts. I believe over a third of Americans have been directly affected by these kinds of extreme weather events. So does that begin to connect? Are people connecting those dots? I would say in our larger research, we're finding that Americans are just starting to connect the dots between climate change and these extreme weather events. So again, I think this is one of the really important opportunities of the insurance industry, because this is what you do. You help us manage and mitigate these kinds of risks, especially from things like extreme weather. Then just to take it one step further, we've also asked Americans, how prepared are you for these? And what we see is that overwhelmingly people are not. Only 4 out of 10 Americans say they even have an emergency supply kit in their home. And only 28% say that they have a disaster emergency plan that all members of their family know about. So we're just not ready, okay? And that's not ready on a household level. And of course, what we all know is we're not ready on an infrastructure level. Our infrastructure in many cases is old and already falling apart and failing, and then you throw these record-setting extreme weather events on them, and it just can't handle it. And we've seen that story over and over and over again, unfortunately, still in real time today. Okay, so now let me turn to what we call the Yale Climate Opinion Map. So this is a tool, an interactive tool that we've made available on our website. I encourage you to come look, or just Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps, and you'll easily find it. And this is our attempt to try to provide you this kind of information at the state and local levels where so many of you are actually working. Because it's great to have these national numbers, but in the end, if you're working in, let's say, Nebraska, you care about what people in Nebraska think, not necessarily what people on the coast think. So we have produced this tool that helps you understand, here's what people currently understand about climate change, how they perceive the risk, what kinds of policies they support, what kinds of behaviors are they taking, all the way down to even the county level. And so let me show you quickly what that looks like. So this first slide that I'm showing you is just at the national level, the national average of worry about climate change. And what you can see is that as of the end of 2020, 63% of Americans said that they were worried about global warming. Again, useful number, but not so useful if you're working in a particular state or a particular location. So when we then look at how that translates at the county level across the country with this next slide, you see that there's tremendous variation across the country. So the darker the red, the more people in that county are worried, and the darker blue, the less worried they are. And what you see is that there is variation across the country, that not all Americans are equally worried about this issue. And this kind of map has lots of really fascinating patterns in it, which I don't have time to talk about, but I will just point you to Texas as one of my favorite examples, because Texas in many people's minds is just this conservative, very rightward, state, often led by climate denying governors. It seems like it's one of the last places in the country you could have a constructive conversation about climate change. It turns out that's just not true. When you look within the state of Texas, the county level, you see a whole series of counties that I encourage you to look at right along, say, the border with Mexico, that are more worried about climate change than most of the counties in California, liberal California. What's going on there? Well, this relates to other research that we've done that finds that actually contrary to common wisdom, which is that only white, well-educated, latte-sipping liberals care about climate change, it's just not true. The demographic that cares the most about climate change are Latinos. And that's what you're seeing right there along the border in Texas and, of course, in other critical states across the country. And this is one of the fastest demographics that's reshaping politics, culture, society across America. So it's just to say that there's tremendous things that you can learn by looking at this level. So now just to reinforce what I was saying about this sense of distance that many people have, in this next slide, we ask people, do you think global warming will affect plants and animals? Okay. And what we see is that there's just a huge already consensus across the country. I mean, 71% of Americans think that yes, global warming will harm plants and animals, as in not people, but plants and animals. There's only one county in America, which if you look at this map, you'll be able to find it, where you don't have a majority of the population that thinks this, okay? So that's, will global warming harm plants and animals? But how about will it harm people in the United States? So now let's look at the next slide. And you see already that not so much, okay? The colors have shifted dramatically into the yellow and even into the blue. How about how big of a risk is it to, and how much will it harm you personally? And if you then look at the next slide, is that it suddenly becomes very, very blue. That's because, again, far fewer people think that global warming will affect them directly, even though we are, of course, all being affected right now. But people aren't yet connecting the dots between climate change and these extreme weather events and all the other related events that are directly related to climate change. So again, this is still a critical opportunity for all of us, including the insurance industry, to help people better understand that this is actually happening right now. This is not distant in time and space. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the fact that, we often talk about the public, but there is no single public on climate change or frankly, any important issue. And so I want to quickly introduce you to Global Warming's 6 Americas, that there are 6 very different audiences in this country that each respond to this issue very differently. And that's vital for you to be thinking about when you're talking about your consumers or your constituents. They're not all the same. So here I'm showing you these 6 different groups. The first is a group we call the alarmed. They're already convinced it's happening, human caused, urgent. They strongly support action. Then a group we call the concerned. They also think it's happening, human caused and serious, but they still think of it as distant in time and space. So they don't yet see this as an immediate risk. Then come the cautious, and they're still on the fence. Is this real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious? Is it overblown? They're paying attention, but are still kind of confused. Then a small, but I think important group we call the disengaged, who basically say, I don't know anything about this. I think I once heard that term climate change or global warming, but I don't know what it is or why I should even pay attention to it. Then comes a group we call the doubtful. And these are people who say, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's just natural cycles. So they don't pay much attention to it or see it as much of a risk. And then last but not least are the group we call the dismissive, who are firmly convinced this is not happening. It's not human caused. It's not serious. And overwhelmingly, they tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away our sovereignty, or it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and other such conspiracy-type narratives. But importantly, they're only 8%. They're only 8%, but they're a really loud 8%. Okay, they tend to dominate the public square and make people think that they're half or more of the country, but they're not. Okay, in fact, 92% of the country is actually happy to have a constructive conversation about climate change. Okay, so don't let the tiny 8%, and in fact, it's even a tinier proportion that are actually active on, say, social media, et cetera, dominate and intimidate everyone else into climate silence, because that's what we too often find across the country is people are afraid to talk about climate change because they're afraid of starting an argument with one of these very, very small minority of people. Now, just to reemphasize the fact that there are very different views about, and conversations happening, this next slide is, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what question would you ask? You see that the groups, the doubtful and the dismissive on the right-hand side of your screen, their main question is, how do you know that it's happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, they're asking, why should I trust you? The middle groups are saying, okay, so it's happening in human caused, but so what? Why should I care? How does this connect to anything in my life or that I care about? And the alarmed and concerned groups, on the other hand, are saying, okay, I got it. It's happening. It's human caused. It's serious. But what do we do? What do we do? What can I do as an individual? What can we do as a community? What can we do as a nation and the world to solve this? And again, insurance is one of those incredibly powerful tools that we have developed as human beings to help us manage these exact kind of risks. So again, you are very uniquely positioned to help engage the larger community, not just here in the United States, but around the world in this critical issue. And then the last slide I just want to show is that we've been tracking the changes in these 6 different groups over time. And what we've seen is a dramatic shift, is that back in 2015, the alarmed and the dismissive, those kind of two polar opposites, were basically tied at 11 and 12% each. But since then, the alarmed have grown by 15 percentage points, while the dismissive have actually dropped pretty substantially. And now the alarmed outnumber the dismissive more than 3 to 1. Okay, that reflects a fundamental shift in the underlying social, cultural, and political climate of climate change. And that's why we're now seeing very robust conversations happening at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, even including by Republican mayors and governors and so on, who are addressing an issue that is far more real for many people than it was 10 years ago. So it's just to say the tides are shifting very dramatically on this issue. So just to conclude, what are the main recommendations I have for you? One is simple. Talk about it. Talk about it with your colleagues. Talk about it with your employees. Talk about it with your constituents. Talk about it with your customers. Okay? They're looking to you as a trusted source because, again, this industry helps us manage and mitigate risk. Know your audience. Who are they? And meet them where they are, not where you are. I cannot emphasize that enough. You need to be thinking and putting yourself in their shoes, helping them address the issue and engage the issue based on where they are, not where you are, okay? And one tool to help you do that is to think of these 6 different Americas, okay? And trying to figure out who is this person or who is this community I'm trying to engage? Where are they in that spectrum? Because you need a very different approach given if they're alarmed versus cautious versus doubtful. And then there's no formulas here, but just a really helpful guideline. Simple, clear messages. Simple, clear messages, not complicated. Okay? Repeat it often, 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 repeat it often. We usually forget that part. By a variety of trusted messengers, which of course includes you. And then just to bring it back to where we started, at least the 5 key ideas that we think everybody should understand. Scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. And then just last, we put all of our research available to us, the world on our website. So if you are ever interested in learning more or following to see what the latest results are, please just come to visit our website and sign up. And with that, thank you very much and best wishes for the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Dr. Leiserowitz. Next, to discuss climate strategy best practices from both a regulatory and industry perspective is Thomas B. Leonardi. Mr. Leonardi served as the Insurance Commissioner for Connecticut, where he played a big role regulating insurers in the U.S. Then, as Executive Vice President at AIG, he helped set climate policy inside one of the world's largest insurers. Today, he sits on the board of both the Travelers Companies Incorporated and Athene Life and Annuity affiliate ACRA, where he continues to guide policy. Welcome, Mr. Leonardi.
Good morning. Before I get started, I wanted to thank Commissioner Kreidler for inviting me to participate in this very important climate summit. It's an honor to be able to speak to such a large and influential audience of regulators, policymakers, business leaders, investors, academics, and climate scientists. I also want to thank everyone associated with producing this virtual event for their help and assistance. And finally, I want to mention that my comments today are my own, and that I am not here representing or speaking on behalf of any company, insurance department, or any other organization. The commissioner asked me to share my thoughts on climate and the insurance industry from both a regulatory and industry perspective. So let me start from the regulatory side and then move on to some key initiatives in the insurance sector that companies are employing in order to address the growing threat of climate-related risks. By way of background, I was appointed Connecticut's insurance commissioner in February of 2011. In the early days of my tenure, I felt like I was drinking out of the proverbial fire hose every single day. There were so many issues to deal with, and trying to figure out which were the most important and how to prioritize my efforts were somewhat overwhelming. These included the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act in the aftermath of the financial crisis, implementing the new healthcare law and assisting in the creation of the state's health insurance exchange, the NAIC's Solvency Modernization Initiative and its many components, including revisions to the Model Holding Company Act, own risk solvency assessments, enterprise risk reports, supervisory colleges, as well as fast-moving international regulatory proposals regarding capital standards, systemic risk designations, and a variety of other initiatives that all could or would have significant impact on the industry and consumers. Now, you'll note that climate was not on my early list of challenges, but just a few short months after I assumed office, and in the midst of all these other challenges, 2 events occurred that put climate-related issues front and center for me. The first was in August of 2011, when Tropical Storm Irene inflicted enormous damage, not just on coastal Connecticut, but throughout all of New England, dropping copious amounts of rain inland, resulting in what was then unprecedented flooding and devastation. I remember the day after the storm, walking door to door along the shoreline with the mayor of East Haven, meeting with distraught residents who in many instances had lost everything, their houses completely washed away and only foundations remaining. Within 90 days of Irene, and again within 90 days after Superstorm Sandy, which also inflicted very heavy damage on my state a year later, insurers had already paid nearly 95% of all Connecticut claims received. This is very significant because it allows communities to rebuild more rapidly and maximizes resiliency. A year later, I went back to East Haven with Governor Malloy, and we met with residents who were recovering from the storm, many of whom had already begun to rebuild their homes. One person who was not rebuilding, however, was an older gentleman whose house had been destroyed. He told us that he only bought homeowners insurance because his bank required it. So when he paid off the mortgage the year before, he decided he no longer needed to continue making these insurance premium payments and decided not to renew his policy. And so he had no funds to rebuild. A tragic story indeed, but it highlighted for me as a new commissioner, in no uncertain terms, the role that insurance plays in resiliency and recovery. The other event was a call I received from Commissioner Kreidler that same year. While I was in my first year as commissioner, Mike had already served for a decade, and even back then was one of the most experienced members of the NAIC. He was also a leader at that time in the regulatory community in terms of understanding the impact of climate change on the insurance industry. He and then California Commissioner Dave Jones were working on a proposal at the NAIC that would require insurers to file a financial disclosure that would reflect the impact on climate-related issues on a company's business. It was not gaining sufficient traction at the NAIC, so they asked me if I would support the initiative. You see, even though it was not likely to become an NAIC requirement at that point in time, by having the regulator of the country's largest insurance market, California, and the regulator of the second largest insurance industry in the country, Connecticut, agreeing to join Washington State in mandating this disclosure would effectively create a national requirement. Now, looking back a decade later, it's hard to believe this disclosure initiative could have been controversial, but it was. The key point was that we as regulators of this critical industry did not know what the real impact of climate change was on the companies that we regulated. Not just on the liability side in terms of claims exposure, concentrations of risk and liquidity, but also from the asset side of the insurance balance sheet in terms of risks embedded in debt and equity securities of the companies in which the insurer's investment portfolios were held. I thought this disclosure proposal made great sense and agreed to join on as the third member of the group of regulators supporting this initiative. I will admit that I had some trepidation in advance of my calls to the executives of the large property casualty companies I regulated in telling them that I was endorsing the disclosure requirement. To my delight, the response from those companies was very supportive. They pointed out that they are first and foremost in the risk business, and that climate change and global warming were undeniably increasing risk worldwide. The increasing frequency and severity of storms left no doubt about that. And they were, as a matter of good business practice, tracking this risk to their assets and liabilities. So taking internal data and using that in a public disclosure document in and of itself would not present a significant burden or issue. The disclosure was eventually adopted by the NAIC. And today we have several disclosure reporting frameworks, the most prominent being the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. A TCFD, as it is known, is where companies set forth how they identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. In many instances, companies already were providing the information contained in a comprehensive TCFD, just not in one place or one document. This information was often contained piecemeal in their proxy reports, other SEC filings, annual reports, 10Ks, press releases, and similar public documents. Bringing all of this together in a well-drafted and comprehensive TCFD report makes it a far more streamlined process for the company, and it allows its various constituents from regulators, shareholders, employees, and investors, as well as the general public, to look to one place where all this information is readily available. In fact, the NAIC now allows a company to file a TCFD to meet its disclosure requirement without having to file the original NAIC disclosure form. But that initial disclosure, championed by Commissioner Kreidler over a decade ago, was critical to this development. And it continues to be imperative that insurance regulators have the information and tools needed to fully assess the risks of those companies that they regulate, and that insurers continue to refine their reporting and use it in practice to continually improve and enhance the effectiveness of their climate strategies. Let me turn now from the regulatory view to the industry perspective. Property casualty insurers are in the weather business and have been at the forefront of recognizing the risks associated with climate change for a long time now. It's critical to their bottom line and to their shareholders, employees, customers, and, as I just mentioned, to their regulators. Their business and success depends heavily on understanding not only the current risk environment, but also how climate change is most likely to impact risks in the future. The industry has a number of third-party modeling companies like AIR and RMS, but virtually all large property casualty companies also have highly sophisticated proprietary models tailored to their product line and specific geographic footprint. These companies are insuring individuals and businesses against the impact of wind, wildfires, drought, floods, and other risks. So it's critical for insurers to have a deep understanding of the factors that impact their underwriting and pricing decisions. They look to underwriting volatility, concentrations of risk, they model out expected losses, and they maintain a deep database that provides insights into how risks perform over many decades, including the most rapidly changing impacts of advancing global warming. On the asset side, many companies hold investment portfolios that are heavily invested in highly rated bonds and other debt securities, and these portfolios turn over quite frequently. So while the liability scenarios have a long-term view of 40 to 50 years out, the short duration of the asset side of the balance sheet allows companies to adjust their investment portfolios much more rapidly as the evolving risks require. But insurers don't stop just there. Risk management, resiliency, innovation, and product development are other ways in which insurers help their clients to address the growing risk posed by climate change. Historically, the industry has stepped up to use technology and risk management capabilities to help reduce risks in all sorts of areas, from auto and road safety to fire prevention, worker safety, and so on. Let me share some examples. Innovation in capacity and coverage is one. Over the past decade, insurance-linked securities and catastrophe bonds have become a major component of worldwide economic support for both risk underwriting and claims payments. While there was some skepticism about the long-term viability of this product, for example, what happens when interest rates rise or when substantial losses are incurred by investors, would the cat bond market retreat or disappear? That clearly has not been the case, as insurance-linked securities now represent more than $45 billion in global insurance claims paying capacity. Another innovation is that many of these cat bonds and ILS instruments utilize parametric triggers, for example, using pre-agreed upon levels of wind speed or rainfall amounts as parameters as to when coverage automatically applies. And this drastically reduces coverage disputes and speeds up claim payments. Infrastructure is another example, as insurers are one of the most significant investors in worldwide infrastructure projects, financing both new infrastructure in emerging growth countries and in rebuilding or replacing aging infrastructure in developed nations. And in some cases, these same insurers are the leading underwriters of the risks associated with these massive projects. Insurers are providing workers' compensation policies, property, liability, surety bonds, and other coverages. Another example is building key partnerships, since the insurance industry can't solve all of these problems alone. One company has paired with a leading engineering firm and a high-profile nonprofit to help build resilient cities, while another partners with an environmental nonprofit to plant over 3 million trees in an effort to combat the effects of global warming. Insurers' involvement in the Insurance Development Forum, working in concert with the World Bank and the United Nations, is another example where the industry is helping to assist developing nations with solutions as to how to increase insurance penetrations in a commercially reasonable way. This is key because a high insurance penetration rate signals a much more resilient community than one with little or no insurance. Other examples are providing funding for the Wharton Risk Center, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and the Build Strong Coalition, among others. Another example is through education, awareness, and transparency. Insurers need to explain on a large scale how insurance can be a mechanism to address the impacts of climate change and build resilient communities. But we also have to understand that a large part of the problem is embedded in socioeconomic factors and in public policy, things like building codes, population growth, and the population density in high at-risk areas of the world that put people and infrastructure in harm's way. While the industry is not a significant carbon emitter in and of itself, many insurers nonetheless have focused on reducing their own corporate carbon footprint by upgrading offices with high-efficiency lighting, using sustainably manufactured products, and energy-efficient mechanical infrastructure and computer server technologies. Companies are also supporting the transition to a lower carbon footprint by developing products that encourage the use of renewables like wind and solar, using their investment portfolio to invest in green technologies, and by promoting stronger building code standards that can help withstand current and future severe weather risks and grow and create greater resiliency. Some insurers are funding education and awareness campaigns to help foster a better understanding around issues like preparedness, coastal risk, and flooding. Lastly, in very severe storms, it may be quite a while before roads are cleared and make damage assessment possible through live in-person inspections. The use of technology has enabled insurers to assess damage and accelerate the claims payment process using drones and artificial intelligence in place of actual live visits. So all of these efforts in disclosure, innovation, partnership building, education, product innovation, and technology highlight some of the ways that the industry is leading on addressing climate-related issues. I hope you found these comments helpful, and many thanks again for the opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leonardi. We'd like to welcome back to Climate Summit 2021 Washington State Poet Laureate Rena Priest. In her presentation, Dreaming Our Way Forward, she turns to poetry to examine climate change. Hear how Ms. Priest builds a bridge from old beliefs to posing new possibilities and uncovering today's mysteries. Welcome, Ms. Priest.
Stories are a way to connect, to build resonance. It is said that what makes humans so advanced is not our thumbs, but our ability to tell stories, to collectively adopt beliefs and organize ourselves around stories to adopt a shared identity, to be bound together by the stories we believe. It's not magic, it's even better. I found this quote by renowned Nisqually leader Billy Frank Jr. He says, "I don't believe in magic. I believe in the sun and the stars, the water, the tides, the floods, the owls, the hawks flying, the river running, the wind talking. They're measurements. They tell us how things are, how healthy we are, because we and they are the same. That's what I believe in. Those who learn to listen to the world that sustains them can hear the message brought forth by salmon." Billy Frank Jr. worked tirelessly to restore and protect Salish Sea salmon runs. As rivers warm and salmon runs dwindle, the message brought forth is that we are in peril. We can learn to listen to the world that sustains us. The law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. It's going to take more than technological innovation and creativity to restore balance to our planet. It's going to take a transformation of our most deeply held beliefs. In order to direct our collective energy toward respectful, reciprocal relationships with nature, we must get something back for what we give. And what we get must nourish our spirits as well as our bodies. We must believe with fervor that even above God and country, politics, and the economy, the health of our planet is what truly matters. What new stories will nourish these beliefs? What new powerful stories will be the spark for our transformation? In many tribal stories, the life force is God, and it is in the land, the water, and all living things. The ancestors told powerful stories of our place in the garden. They knew their stories to be true. What if you believed them too? Could you know that you are also the earth? Could you return to the garden? Now more than ever, we must push ourselves to see in new ways. We are in a time where it's going to be crucial to imagine a new world and a new way forward toward change. Artists and storytellers are catalysts for this imagining. Creation is our business. We are cultural change agents. We are cultural change agents, and we offer fresh perspectives and entice human culture toward evolution. The world, after all, is made brick by brick of stories, images, and models. They take shape in the world first by inspiring a new way of seeing. In my tribal language, we have a phrase, Ekhosuehi. It translates as good feelings. But I'm told that specifically it is the state when your heart and mind are one. There is no conflict between what you feel and what you think. When your heart and mind are in resonance, you can be in resonance with the things and people around you. Be one with them. This is what we mean by good feelings. The elders say that you should be in this state when you make something new or when making decisions. You should be in this state before you move forward so you can act in a good way. When my daughter was little, she used to like to do the thing where we would both try to sing the same note and see if our voices would disappear into one another, to hear our voices become one sound. This is how we must think if we're going to make a change, something good for our planet, for our children. We must find a common chord and move forward. I have a poem I'd like to share with you today. It speaks to this idea that I've been talking about. The poem is called Resonance. It has an epigraph by the philosopher Anaxagoras. All things were together. The mind came and arranged them. The flicker of a wave on the sea is a flame, not like a candle on a cake keeping tally of our days. Instead, the fire measures life together by the sweetness of resonance. How exalted by the dawn, we as one have sung our true song, become a single voice across the waves. The wax of a candle begins inside the humming darkness of a hive, but before that, it begins as sunlight, calling forth blossoms, pollen, and bees who play matchmaker to trees, calling forth fruit to become new seeds. Where does love begin? It is a surprise, but obvious and easy, like breathing. It has been there all along, a flicker on the sea that swam up from the deep to touch air and light to shine like fire, leap from its element the way a tree becomes a boat so the earth can leap into the sea and sail toward adventure. Things are changed, things transform. This is the way the mind arranged it. The mind comes and arranges. The heart draws it all back toward union, washes away the illusion of separateness, gives new measures for happiness, a new way to celebrate the state of being of one heart and one mind, Ekhosuehi. Our song is a ferry that joins two shores.
Thank you, Ms. Priest. It's time we reimagine the private sector and market approaches to sustainability. Here to offer what is possible is Michelle Lancaster, Director of Sustainability at Microsoft. She'll share Microsoft's story, including the case for action-oriented climate optimism. Welcome, Ms. Lancaster.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Lancaster, Director of Sustainability at Microsoft. Microsoft and I personally am delighted to be back again this year, and thank you to the Washington office of the Insurance Commissioner and to Commissioner Kreidler for extending this invitation to share Microsoft's work with everyone in Washington and beyond. We are in the midst of reimagining Microsoft's own role and what we can do on sustainability, starting with many commitments we made last year. But we're also in the middle of a reimagining of what companies should be doing on sustainability. So today, I want to walk you through briefly what Microsoft is doing, why we've changed over the years, what we think other companies can gain from our experience, and what we think the world needs next from companies when it comes to climate change. So we'll start with a story. Many people, especially in the insurance industry, have seen what the last year has brought in terms of extreme weather, floods, droughts, and other impacts around the world posed by climate change. What I'd like to talk about is a story that came out of Germany in the village that flooded recently. And one of the pieces that has stuck with me from that story is a commentary from one of the local officials who described what happened in their town as the result of a failure of imagination. He said we simply could not imagine that this would happen here. We understand that climate change is real. We understand that it's happening, but we thought that was something that was still happening somewhere else. After all, in Germany, we measure our carbon, we have solar panels, but they've realized, and he continued, we have to do what we can to limit it, and we have to learn to live with it because it's too late to stop or prevent it. Now, this is not a climate negative talk. We are going to maintain a case for optimism, but that statement of a failure of imagination really stuck with me. And it's helped us at Microsoft start to think about what is the right way to not only imagine the future, but to start to take action against it. Because as we've seen, we don't have to imagine the future anymore. Climate change is real, it is happening now, and it's impacting the lives and the livelihoods of millions of people across the globe, including those right here in Washington, as we've seen with wildfires and an extremely hot summer so far this year. The IPCC, as part of the UN, recently released a report that was entitled essentially Code Red for the Planet. We don't have to imagine the future of our planet. We know, and it's being written out every single day. Climate change is already impacting every area across the world, changing things from rainfall to planting seasons, and basically everything in between. So it's not a failure of imagination to see that the world is changing around us. What we need to continue to fight against is the failure to reimagine our role in charting that new future. At Microsoft, we really started about 1.5 years ago with reimagining the way that corporate sustainability should function at Microsoft and beyond. And we did that by starting to look at what companies can realistically do in this space. For a long time, sustainability in the private sector was viewed as risk mitigation, as a nice to have in a CSR function, and really focused on minimizing operational impact. We think there's a lot more that should be imagined in the role that companies should play. We can look at ourselves as a customer and what are we asking of our suppliers? We are also a supplier. What are we asking our suppliers to do for us? We partner with thousands of organizations across the world. How should we work with them, communicate our values and expectations? We also work with our employees on a regular basis who are asking us to do more. And we're also a regulated entity that publicly reports our earnings every year. What are investors asking of us, and how can we work together to unlock new finances across the board? And finally, policy. It is inescapable that in climate change, we need policymakers across the board at every level to lean in. And we really think businesses have an obligation and an opportunity to say, we're with you in this. Please don't worry about business reaction to regulation. In fact, we need more of it to move more quickly. So that failure to imagine beyond an operational role was the first thing that we tackled, and really imagining what are all of those positions of influence and how do we move forward. And from there, we set a series of industry-leading commitments. We pledged to become carbon negative by 2030 and remove all of our historical emissions by 2050. We continued beyond carbon and looked at water. We intend to be a water positive company by 2030 by replenishing more than we use around the world. We also intend to be a zero waste company by 2030. And that means not only reducing and removing our own waste from everything from construction out in Redmond all the way down to what we landfill and what we recycle, but also really thinking about our devices and the packaging that goes around them. How do we get out of plastic, and how do we make those both more recyclable and out of more recycled materials, but also more repairable? So really thinking about extending the life of those and then improving the materials. And finally, protecting more land than we use in our ecosystems commitment. So we set all of those last year and really started to dream big about what that future for Microsoft should be. I'm pleased to report that we've made a lot of progress since we announced those commitments last year. In January of 2021, we published our first sustainability report, 95 pages chock full of not only what Microsoft said we were going to do, how we progressed against those goals, and then increasingly a strategy playbook for others that can follow our own commitments. So we have begun to spend money. We've begun to invest in new venture funds. We've taken action to reduce our own emissions, cutting our carbon emissions about 7% over the last year, and continue to move on from there. So I want to give you kind of a sneak peek into what we've done, and then we can talk about how that is leading into a new area of opportunity for Microsoft and for our customers. We still think that the first key is to really make sure that Microsoft is dedicating itself to meeting our goals. And to meet our goals, we're going to have to work with our customers, develop new products, and develop new markets. Let's start with carbon, because that's where we started in January of last year. We have already purchased 1.3 million tons of carbon removal out of the market last year. We issued the largest carbon removal RFP that's ever been issued, and we're pleasantly surprised to find so many eager and willing projects and participants. We have a lot more work to do. There is a lot more that needs to be done to grow the carbon removal market as we move forward. And one of the things the IPCC report called out is just how important it is to not just reduce emissions, but start to remove them. We've also reduced carbon amongst our supply chain by up to about 21 million metric tons. And we have made considerable steps to work with other companies across industries and transform to net zero. We've also made progress on water. Already 1.5 million people this year will receive access to safe drinking water through our efforts around accessibility around the globe. We financed 20 new water replenishment projects, including some here in the Pacific Northwest, to make sure that we are protecting water and making sure that it is available in the future. We've also made significant progress on our waste commitments, achieving 60,000 metric tons of waste diversion from landfills in the past year, and beginning to make new investments in building what's called the circular economy. So not just reducing our waste, but building new markets and new methods to make sure that materials stay in circuit longer. And finally, our ecosystems commitment. We have made considerable progress there as well. We committed to protecting more land than we use, a goal that we are on track to reach this year. We also committed to building something called a planetary computer, which basically means that we are taking the data around the planet from geospatial all the way to ground sensors and really developing the data layer that explains how much of what is where in the natural world and how it's changing over time, and then creating really easy to use applications over top of that. So you don't need to be a geospatial engineer, nor do you need to be a data scientist to be able to query if perhaps folks in your supply chain are abiding by their no deforestation clauses in their contracts, or understanding how your particular crop can change over time. So we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a lot of work left to do. And part of that work is really around knowing when we need help. I know that may seem strange as a company like Microsoft, but we cannot do this alone. No company can. That is why we've devoted considerable effort in the past year to build cross-sector organizations that have never existed before, such as Transform to Net Zero with some of our friends in the Pacific Northwest, including Starbucks and Nike, a cross-sector organization that is intended to enable fast follows for companies of all sizes, as well as the Water Resilience Coalition, a UN-led effort that Microsoft is part of to help facilitate best practices, data sharing, and learnings across organizations of all types and sizes to make sure that we're using as little water as possible and replenishing as much as possible. But we know that we're not alone in this journey too, and we have been delighted to see that many other companies are starting to reimagine their role as well. It's starting to open up new markets and new opportunities. We've seen already that there's about 161% growth in companies setting net zero targets just in the last year, and nearly 2,000 organizations have stated support for what's the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. So not only are companies setting targets, they're increasingly willing and eager to report on that progress in detailed manner to companies and investors across the board. Now, all of that is also happening against a backdrop of additional policy measures where countries are increasingly pledging their support towards net zero and taking new steps to regulate industries. We're seeing investors make even more pointed calls for companies to set targets and disclose transparently against those targets. And we're seeing that it's also starting a friendly competition in markets across sectors where being the leader in net zero is really something that is increasingly important to companies. Now, what does all of that mean for Microsoft and for other companies in this space? Well, it means that we get to reimagine the role of the private sector all up, and particularly a technology company, as not just one that is trying to minimize its footprint, but one that can really maximize new opportunities and accelerate progress towards the future. That's certainly how Microsoft is looking at it. We see that technology has an incredibly important role to play in addressing climate change and building new systems, new solutions, new reporting measures that can really help the world accelerate towards net zero. And these are not altruistic measures, although they are definitely for the public good. We see that there are incredible market opportunities for those that move quickly on this. There are anywhere from $60 billion in energy optimization opportunities driven through technology, all the way to expectations of a $200 billion carbon offset market just by 2030. So companies are starting to think about how can we shift from being less bad to doing more good, and how can doing more good actually benefit people, planet, and the profit line. And when you harness all of those together, you can start to unleash some very serious innovation. That's the other part of Microsoft's strategy that I want to update you on today. We have fully embraced sustainability across the company. So not just thinking about this from a reduction measure or from a CSR measure, but really engaging our engineers and our customer-facing sales leads to understand, what does the world need and expect of Microsoft? What is the role technology can play? And where can we help things go faster? And so we've started to think about how we build sustainability into our core products. So making sure that the Word and Office and Teams calls that you're making every single day have as minimal a carbon footprint as possible. And we're sharing that information with you transparently so you can trust us as your technology provider, but also thinking together and dreaming together and imagining together, what are the tools and solutions needed to transition whole sectors from hard to abate sectors such as transportation or energy into becoming carbon neutral or even carbon negative industries in the next 10 to 15 years. And for that, we're working really closely with our customers to build new products and solutions around those scenarios, and then really thinking about those wholesale digital transformations. We started with the sustainability calculator last year to make sure that customers don't just see that Microsoft is a company that believes in sustainability, but they're actually able to translate that commitment to sustainability into their own bottom line. So with the calculator, we make sure that every Azure customer can actually see their real-time Azure emissions and understand what we're doing to mitigate them. We're also showing customers how they're able to reduce carbon and save energy and save their energy bills as well. So it's an economic and environmental win when we shift onto the cloud. But that was just us getting started. We are incredibly enthusiastic about a new product that we recently announced this summer called the Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability. And this is where we go from telling customers about what we're doing to really helping customers transform their own business. And so the Cloud for Sustainability is intended for any customer around the world and any industry of any size. And it will help you as a company be able to intake all of the enterprise emissions data that you have today, do that in a way that is not Excel. We know about 80% of the market is still doing sustainability reporting on Excel, which we adore at Microsoft, but we think we have a better solution for you. So the Cloud for Sustainability really pulls in and solves a couple of pain points around automation of data, integration of data across the enterprise, and then really moving from a real-time view of carbon emissions across an enterprise, including a calculation layer, and moving into that insights and action place where we really like to be. So seeing where you are today, but also helping customers see where business decisions can happen to help reduce emissions and change over time. We think this is not only a good product entry into this space that will help customers see their carbon emissions in real time, but we'll expand this into water and waste data in the coming years and really make this a single system of record and a single system of reporting and a single system of reduction that customers can be using as their guidebook to move forward into a net zero economy. We realize, though, that even all of the innovation inside of Microsoft, which is considerable, we're still going to need additional help. And so we're imagining not just the tools of today, but the tools of tomorrow. And to do that, we created a $1 billion climate innovation fund, and we have begun making investments across that in the past year. That fund is really intended to provide early capital to new types of products, from carbon removal to circular economy and really everywhere in between, with a focus on climate equity and climate justice to make sure that the world and everyone on the world is getting what they need in order to survive and thrive in the coming years. That Climate Innovation Fund is really our advance arm into creating technologies in the markets that we think we'll need into the future. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about progress and then also imagination. I think, one of the things when a report like the UN report comes out, it is sometimes really difficult to stay optimistic in the face of planetary code red. But we've already seen that imagination in the climate change space, coupled with technology, coupled with policy, and coupled with collective will of the people, can move incredibly quickly in ways that we never could have imagined before. So just a couple of examples, a reason for some hope and to retain that imaginative spirit. Solar is 300 times cheaper over the past 40 years. We really saw a complete bottoming out of solar adoption, while the cost really dropped fairly dramatically at a level that we did not think was going to happen in that time frame. Wind power has seen a similar adoption across the board, where there are now parts of the EU that are fully powered by wind in some backup areas. We also know that the growth of EVs has gone from a trickle to a full-scale transformation, with countries like Norway already at a very high EV adoption and countries like the UK close behind. So we can imagine a better future. This does not need to be a failure of imagination to believe that climate change is happening or that we can do anything about it. In fact, we absolutely can. We just need to work together, and we need to make sure that those efforts and abilities are accessible to everybody. And I'll just close for a second here as we think about what kind of future we want to imagine for ourselves, for our children, as we think about what the future should be for private sector action and for Microsoft in this space. There's a quote by Deepak Chopra that we think about. The best use of imagination is creativity, and the worst use of imagination is anxiety. Anxiety paralyzes us, and we don't have time to be paralyzed anymore. We've spent the last year really kicking our efforts into high gear, really reorganizing ourselves around the idea of what is possible, and then working really hard to implement action plans and roadmaps and the technologies and tools to track our progress against it. We're excited to bring those tools into the market this year, and we hope next year, if we return again, that it's potentially in person, but either way, I think we'll have even more to share. It's not enough for one company to set ambitions. It's not enough for one company to act, but if we think about the role of companies and the way that they can spread that change up and down their supply chain and across their consumer base, we all start to act together, we can actually imagine a world where we get to somewhere pretty close to those Paris targets. And that is what we are focused on every day at Microsoft, imagining and then building that future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lancaster. Next, we'll hear from Anna Pinheiro Privette, the leader of Amazon's Sustainability Data Initiative. This program seeks to leverage Amazon's scale, technology, and infrastructure to help create global innovation for sustainability. Welcome, Ms. Privette.
My name is Anna Pinheiro Privette, and I'm with the sustainability team at Amazon. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, which is a Tech for Good program that we launched in 2018. And it's really an opportunity for us to leverage Amazon scale, our technology, and our infrastructure to help innovate and problem solve in the space of sustainability. And today I'm going to be talking specifically about the climate domain and the climate crisis. So just for a little bit of context. So as we all know, and we understand from our day-to-day, data is really core to addressing this climate crisis. And we have more data now than ever. You know, there's new satellite sensors, new and more sophisticated models, new IoT devices. And so although this is necessary and exciting, it also brings a lot of challenges to the way we are trying to tackle these issues. The data is growing exponentially. It comes from all these different forms and sources, so it's very different in different formats. The types of users and the technical expertise that they have to analyze these data sets is also very diverse, and obviously there's very many different tools out there that have different requirements. So what that means is that this creates a set of challenges for those of us that need to acquire and analyze all these data sets to actually extract some knowledge and insights to help us not only monitor, but also manage this situation we are in. In addition to that, there's this compounding challenge that we are experiencing, which is the fact that all this effort of finding the right data, acquiring it, storing it, cleaning it, it's really repeated consistently all over the world, right? So every data scientist, every data analyst out there that is nowadays trying to understand how they are impacting the climate and how the climate is impacting us in our day-to-day, in our business, in our communities, is having to identify these key data sets and go through all these additional steps and efforts that actually has been referenced at accounting for about 80% of the total effort necessary to actually generate new knowledge and insights. So at AWS and Amazon, we call this undifferentiated heavy lifting. And what it means is that there's all this effort that everybody's repeating that is not really helping us contribute to that body of knowledge for us to advance the science and the application in the climate space. So what we're trying to do here, and what Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative is trying to do, is really to seek to promote more innovation and problem solving in the space of climate change and sustainability more broadly, by using our technology to reduce the cost, the time, and also the technical barriers that it takes to take this big data and data sets that we have spread all over the world and make them more accessible and usable to solve problems like this. So as we try to do this and encourage the community to move in this direction, or to lend these resources to the community, we really are asking for a bit of a change in the way that things are done. So traditionally, when you have a data scientist or a data analyst do some kind of analysis, the traditional method is that it goes and identifies where the data set is, traditionally downloads the data, bring it to their own servers or computers, and does that for several data sets, he or she, and then does the analysis right there where, like in their local computers. And that's the most prevalent way of doing science, and it's been done for a while. So what we're really asking is to shift this paradigm. And instead of moving all this data around across the world, can we just have a centralized place where we put like a golden copy of the data that is really relevant for the community? We agree that it's the value. And we, instead of that, bring the data next to the computing, where the computing is in the cloud, and encourage people to bring their code and their development. And this is good for many reasons, right? So one is that, again, all that effort is minimized. We only go through the effort one time of bringing the data, of acquiring it, of paying for the storage, of cleaning it, and making it as accessible to the community as possible. But there's the additional value that we're really reducing the carbon footprint of storing all this data around the world, which can be quite significant. And as you see in this image, I have a few examples. It might sound really technical, but of like different AWS and Amazon services and tools that are already next to the data. And that facilitates the analysis of the data in the cloud. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've done and what are the core pillars for this program. So we have developed this tree structure that is really focused on these three core components. The first one is based on democratization of data. So again, what we do is we engage with the broader community in the sustainability and the climate space and identify what are those key foundational data sets that the majority of the community will need to use, and that we're all struggling to analyze and store, and some of them are really gigantic, and obviously, we need to have all the storage associated for this. And so what we do is once we identify those data sets, we work to the extent possible with the data providers like the NASAs, NOAAs, the EPAs of the world and say, okay, we will host the data in the cloud. We'll cover the cost for storing the data and egressing if somebody decides to take it out. But you basically commit to make the data publicly available to the world and maintaining it. And so we've been building this catalog for a few years, and we have petabytes and petabytes of data that is openly available to anybody. And I'll provide some access to that information if you want to explore further. The second component is enabling better access to compute. And what we're saying here, well, it's great. We now have the data. It's freely available. It's much easier now to come and experiment, but there's a cost, right, to use the compute. So we don't want that to be a barrier. So we created a dedicated grant program for the cloud so that anybody, we have an open call for proposals, anybody can apply and basically access a grant for a period of a year to analyze the data or prototype a new solution in the cloud or create a new tool or software. And that's basically in the space of sustainability and climate change. If you have an idea, you can apply for one of those grants and be subsidized to do that work for a period of a year. And then the third component is really focused on promoting knowledge exchange. And what we mean here is that there's a recognition that big data, cloud computing, AI, all of those things are fairly new for the space of climate change and for the climate scientists. And we're trying to encourage as much as possible those that are like leading this effort and understanding of how to use the cloud to share their knowledge and their best practices and their code to the extent possible through tutorials and presentations. So we have a series of mechanisms that really encourage people to share those resources to each other, and we share them in our webpage. These are just a few examples of some of those what we call authoritative data providers we work with around the world. You might recognize some of the groups in the US. Most of them are national labs and national government like NOAA, NASA, and NREL and others. But we also work with groups around the world, and some of them in the private sector and in NGOs. And so the main thing in common is that we try to be very selective and curate the content that comes into our catalog so that the data has a certain stamp of authoritativeness and integrity as we bring it in and just make it available to the community. And below you see a few examples of types of data we have, anything from climate data projections to historical weather records, a lot extensive satellite imagery, and a very diverse set of data sets available. Okay, so now I'm going to give you just a few examples of the kind of impact that opening data and putting these resources out there is really creating. And that's actually the really exciting part for us, is to see that it's creating some kind of positive change. So we work extensively across all the sectors. So we believe that this change, and if we want to move this space forward, we really need to work with as much private sector, with NGOs, academia, governments, and I'll give you some examples of those. So in this case, I'm going to give you the example of Solcast. Solcast is a startup in Australia that is using data that NOAA is putting in the cloud. So NOAA basically has a direct connection to our servers. So when the data from the satellites gets to their servers, is sent to ours, basically near real time. And so Solcast built a workload on top of it in the cloud. And because they don't have the cost of acquiring the data, of maintaining it and storing it, it's fairly easy for them to use the compute on demand that the cloud offers to just turn off the process, turn it on, and turn it off when they don't need it anymore. So that's a good example of how opening access to critical data can really be supporting this ecosystem to fight climate change. In this case, they are providing forecast estimates for solar radiation to the solar community and the solar business. So it's a very relevant kind of contribution. The next slide, I'm going to show you an example. We are supporting a nonprofit, and in this case, it's Digital Earth Africa. And we are very interested in understanding how to enable or use the cloud to enable better access to data in what we call communities or underserved communities that traditionally don't have access to those resources. And in this case, we engage with Digital Earth Africa as their technical provider. our technical partner, I would say. And in that sense, we are hosting a lot of the data, petabytes and petabytes of data in our Cape Town AWS region to support this project that is really creating access for governments and communities and the community in general, for participants in general, of information that helps them not only manage and monitor the natural resources, but also is helping with economic development in the region. So we're very excited, and there's really very significant impact that the Digital Earth Africa is creating in the African communities, and we're very excited to support them. Okay, 2 more examples very quickly. And this one I would like to mention, we actually just announced this very recently. In recent weeks. This is a partnership we have created with Silver Lining and with NCAR, and is very focused on democratizing access to not only the data that we've been doing, but also the modeling and the models, right? So in the climate space, for us to advance the knowledge in this space as fast as we can, we believe that we need to open that space and enable as much collaboration as possible. So this is the first time that a climate model is being run at full production in the cloud. And not only the model itself is going to be openly available as open source to anybody, but also all the data and all the simulations that they are being generated will be made available to the world as well through our catalog. So we're very excited with this, with the potential of really contributing to opening this space and advancing the science in the climate space. And the final example I have for you, it's really an example of how we're very committed to projects and collaborations that are trying to advance the space in a collaborative way. And in this case, it might be relevant for the community, particularly here, that is in this summit. We are supporting this project called OS Climate. It's a Linux Foundation project that aims to create an open source platform to help specifically the investment in financial sectors assess climate risk in their asset portfolios. So what we are trying to do here, again, is to find what is that level of effort that all these groups out there are doing, finding the right data, cleaning it, bringing it together, putting some basic tools on top of it to let it analyze the data. And then once all of that is in place, then the different companies can come and build their more proprietary and differentiated work on top of it. But this is the pre-competitive work, and ASDI and the cloud are being, basic blocks for building this infrastructure and this platform as a way to make it open to the broader community. So I think that's all I have to show today. I put this last slide here just to give you additional information for those that are interested in either contacting us or going to our webpage. On the right side, you have additional details if you want to visit our catalog or interested in making your data available to the broader community. We have an opportunity to sponsor that, and of course, access to the cloud grants and customer stories to show the art of the possible, and also the resources that our customers are making available to the community. And I will just finish by saying that we're very interested in understanding how the cloud and in general Amazon's technology and what we have to offer can really open this space or help advance this space. So very eager to hear from you and see if we can support in any way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Privette. Overseeing the construction of the world's first net zero carbon arena is a feat Rob Johnson is proud to be a part of. The arena was known for decades as the Key Arena and was recently renamed and rebuilt into the Climate Pledge Arena. And as Vice President of Transportation and Sustainability, Mr. Johnson and his team are about to reopen its doors. It'll be home to a new national hockey franchise, live concerts, and other events. Visitors will be immersed in perhaps the world's most environmental venue to date. Welcome, Mr. Johnson.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability and Transportation for the Seattle Kraken and the Climate Pledge Arena. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what it's going to take for us to be the first zero carbon certified net zero energy live entertainment venue on the planet. And what you see here is the brand new icon that sits on top of that historic landmark roof on the Seattle Center campus, which is, of course, just about a mile north of downtown Seattle. Inside the building, we're doing some really incredible things to meet the climate pledge. And of course, the climate pledge, as you all likely know, is a set of objectives founded by a nonprofit called Global Optimism and Amazon to meet the Paris Climate Accords by 2040 instead of 2050. This is a crucial decade, the 2020s that we're in right now. If we're going to make dramatic changes to the impact that we're having on climate, we're going to need to make them this decade in order to be net zero by 2040. And to do that, the Climate Pledge Arena has set ourselves a goal of being net zero on the day that we open in October of 2021. What does net zero carbon certification mean? It's a certification run out of Seattle, Washington, a small nonprofit called the International Living Futures Institute, which happens to have what we think is the most stringent set of certification guidelines in the world, and is one that we're attempting to follow in order to really demonstrate our ability to meet the climate pledge commitments on day one. To meet the certification through the International Living Futures Institute, you have to do 4 major things. The first is you have to eliminate all fossil fuels from your building. We were in the process of constructing the building in 2018 when we made the decision to eliminate fossil fuels. So at that point, we converted the various different uses where we were going to have natural gas, like hot water, heating the building, dehumidification for the ice system. We converted all of those internal systems to become all electric. So we're going to be one of the first, if not the first, building in North America of this size to be an all electric facility. Step 2, to meet the certification, you have to have a visible component of renewable energy on site. I'm going to show you some examples of the solar panels that we're going to have on the facility that are going to help generate pretty significant amounts of energy to help make sure that we're meeting that zero carbon certification. The third thing that you have to do is you have to go out and procure the remainder of your energy from new renewable sources. I'm going to talk to you about how we're partnering with Seattle City Light and Amazon in order to achieve that objective. And then finally, we have to ensure that we account for everything happening in the building, all of the operations of the food and beverage coming to and from the building, the retail merchandise that's going to be sold in the building, the artists, the employees, the fans. All of that has to be accounted for the carbon footprint of the building's operation and then offset annually in order to ensure that you're being a carbon neutral facility. When you put all that stuff together, it's a giant amount of work that's going to result in a really incredible set of partnerships that we've got with Amazon, with AWS, with Global Optimism, with nonprofits up and down the West Coast in order to really make this thing happen. So to meet those standards on site, we're going to have some really great solar panels. And here's a visual of what those are going to look like. Don't forget that our roof is a historic landmark. In order to build this arena, we had to hold up that 44 million pound roof, temporary, build out a $1 billion arena underneath it, and then reconnect those historic beams back to their original intent of holding up the roof. So while I would love to put solar panels on that roof, it is prohibited from a landmarks perspective. So what you're seeing in the foreground is the Alaska Airlines atrium, where about 70% of fans are going to be entering into the facility. And we've got solar panels that are going to be attached to the atrium roof. And that combined with the solar panels that we're cantilevering across the street on the roof of a 500 stall parking garage that we manage on behalf of the city, will generate between 3 and 5% of the energy used by the building. So those will be amongst our most very visible components of sustainability. And then we go with our partners at Amazon and ideally our partners at Seattle City Light to go out and procure the remainder of our renewable energy sources from new renewable plants. So we're actively working with them now to identify solar and wind farms that could come online in the next 3 to 5 years that would equate to as much energy as the building would use and then some. So if we're at 5% of our energy coming from our solar panels, let's call that 1 megawatt. We need to go out and procure the other 15 megawatts that we might need from a new renewable energy source. We're looking with our partners at Amazon at City Light at a whole lot of other renewable energy solutions to generate that additional 15 megawatts of energy that they can then get wheeled back into the grid and ensure that our building is powered 100% by new renewable energy sources. There's some other great things that we're doing in the building that are beyond that certification with the International Living Futures Institute. One of them is our rain to rink solution. Our building was designed in the 1960s by an architect named Paul Thiry. And Paul Thiry's vision was to build a building that would pay homage to a traditional Coast Salish rain hat. And for us to be able to collect rainwater coming off of 1/4 of the roof, hold it in an underground 15,000 gallon cistern, and use that rainwater to resurface the ice for our home games and practices, we think is a really wonderful way to make sure that we're paying it forward for future generations. That set of solutions combined with the stormwater management practices that we have on the arena's footprint, as well as the conservation techniques inside the building, like waterless urinals, low flow, shower heads, and other innovations, we think could save as much as 100,000 gallons of water annually from the municipal water system. An important thing as we continue to struggle with drought conditions and need to conserve as much water as we can during the real hot summers that we're having here in Seattle. Another important component of the building's operations to us is the elimination of single-use plastics. You look at an artist who's out on tour right now, like Billie Eilish, and when she comes and plays in an arena, she asks that arena to be banning single-use plastics for one night. Well, we said, if we could do that for one night, why not be able to do it for 365 nights a year? You stand at the front door of our building and you look west and you can see the Puget Sound. And we all know science has proven what a hugely impactful component of microplastics are getting into that water stream and killing our native salmon populations, which of course is having an impact on our native orca populations. In addition, I heard a statistic the other day that the average North American ingests about a credit card size worth of microplastics every week. So undeniably, this has to be having an impact on our human health, from the little plastic film that you put your fruits and vegetables in at the grocery store to the little microplastics that might be in our soap or in our shampoos that we use every day. We've got to get those out of our waste stream. So for us as an arena, we're planning to ban as many single-use plastics as we can on day one, with a plan to phase them all out by 2024. So things like compostable cutlery or compostable plates, all of those things are pretty standard fare in Washington State at sports arenas and venues. We're going to try to go a little bit further by having things like no plastic bags inside the building. So when you buy a souvenir, it won't come with a plastic bag for you to take it home. And of course, no plastic straws or other kind of packaging. And for us, that's part of the continued evolution of educating our fans and encouraging them to take a look at what they could really do to improve their own conservation habits at home. In addition, we're going to have a lot of sustainable and healthy food options inside our building. As much as 75% of our food and beverages are going to be sourced from within 300 miles of the building's front door. We're going to have incredible vegan and vegetarian options, which of course are not only good for the planet, but those are incredible for on brand for Seattle, right? We know we're going to have some really great certification programs, like not just having things be organic, but having them fair trade certified, Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch certified. Things like salmon safe certifications are going to be important to us. And our executive chef, a woman named Molly Demers, is really bringing home sustainability in a very different look and feel than what you might have experienced in other buildings. This is going to look local. It's going to feel local. It's going to be sustainable in a way that I don't think any other arena of its size in the world has ever seen before. Functionally, working with our partners at Waste Management, we're going to be a zero waste building, which means we're going to attempt to divert 97% or more of our waste from landfills and to composting and recycling. A lot of that is going to be reflected in what you can purchase in the building, but we're also going to be educating a lot of our fans in the building with pictographs and other great graphics that will allow for us to be able to show them where they're supposed to be putting what into what bin. And we think this is hugely important for us as an organization. We're going to be tracking it, we're going to be monitoring it, and we're going to continue to try to get better over time. But this is also, of course, where we stand on the shoulders of existing facilities here in Washington State, like T-Mobile Ballpark or Lumen Field, who've been doing this kind of work for years, if not decades. A huge part of the operations of this building is transportation. When you look at the Scope 3 emissions associated with our facility, we estimate as much as 60% of it could come from stuff and people coming to and from the building. So what are we going to really do to help reduce those transportation emissions? Well, we're going to offer fans who don't have an ORCA card through work a free public transit ride for all home Kraken games. And we're going to give you that chance to take light rail, monorail, bus, water taxi, a whole lot of options to get you to and from the building. We're making a $7 million investment in the monorail, which folks may know was built for the 1962 World's Fair. What you're seeing here is a rendering of the new Westlake Station that is set to open on October 1st. And the goal here is to get people from inexpensive parking downtown and the variety of great public transit options that exist downtown to get to the monorail and take that 90-second ride to our building's front door. Those capital improvements, along with what we think will be the first of its kind artist-led carbon offset program, will allow for us to really message and market to our fans that there's a really, really great set of ways to get to and from the building that are green and fast and fun. And of course, all of this is based off of a lot of data. What you're seeing here is a map that shows you where our deposit holders live in Western Washington for our home Kraken games. We're going to be able to rely on this kind of data to capture where folks are coming from through post-event fan surveys, think about how they got to and from the building, and use that to account for not only the carbon footprint associated with our fans, but for everything coming to and from the building. So our partners at Delaware North, our concessionaire, they're going to be tracking where apples are coming from and how we can account for the carbon footprint of that apple and how long it took to get to and from the arena. We're going to be doing the same thing with our retail partners at BDA. We're going to be doing the same thing with our own employees and ensuring that we're accounting for every single thing associated with the carbon footprint of the building. That's a huge component of our operational tracking system. We're working with our partners at AWS to operationalize that, set a carbon footprint associated with it, and then at the end of a calendar year, ensuring that we're offsetting that carbon footprint with credible, nature-based, and sequestration-focused offsets, and ensuring that ideally those are locally based. So we can say to our fans, look at the investments that we're making in our own community that will help really make sure that we are living up to the name on the roof of the building as the Climate Pledge Arena. I'm so honored to have been part of the presentations today. Thank the State Insurance Commissioner for his leadership on this topic, and really hope that we've been able to inspire you to think about ways in which you can reduce your own carbon footprint, either personally or within your company. This is a hard thing to do, but we can do hard things together, particularly when the public sector and the private sector work together. So really grateful for the time, and thank you everybody for your commitment to making our world a better place for the next generation.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Here to explore the drivers and trends that are spurring increased investor and regulatory interest in assessment and disclosure of climate risks is Dr. Yoon Kim. Dr. Kim is the head of Global Client Services, Moody's ESG Solutions. She'll discuss climate data and investment decision-making. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
So first, I'd like to thank the Washington Insurance Climate Summit for having me speak today. My name is Yoon Kim, and I lead client service for Moody's ESG Solutions. And so first, by way of introduction to Moody's ESG Solutions, we are part of the broader Moody's umbrella, and Moody's ESG Solutions was established with the goal of bringing deep domain expertise in both ESG and climate risk to the market. And so Moody's did this through acquisitions in North America in 427 and in Europe in a company called VE to launch Moody's ESG Solutions Group. We focus on ESG and climate-related measures, as well as sustainable finance and benchmarks, which are also integrated with Moody's Analytics, risk management solutions, and Moody's Investor Services credit ratings. So we live under the Moody's umbrella in parallel to the Investor Service, which is the credit rating portion of the agency, and Moody's Analytics. In terms of what I will speak to today, I'll provide an overview of key market drivers and trends that are behind increased interest in climate risk assessment and disclosure, as well as speak to data to help support evaluation of climate risks. When it comes to market drivers and trends, we're seeing increased economic costs with climate change. For example, in 2020, climate-related weather events caused $268 billion of global economic damage, of which 64%, almost 2/3 of this amount, were uninsured. In addition to this, we're seeing increased regulatory pressure as regulators recognize the systemic threat that climate risks pose. And highlights of this landscape include disclosure requirements, typically aligned with TCFD guidance. Europe is leading the way on this front, but we're also seeing regulators in China, New Zealand, and other geographies implement similar requirements. There's also been a push to incorporate climate risk into risk management and supervision, from credit origination to capital requirements. And once again, Europe is leading the way on this front, but we're also seeing countries in other geographies take this on, and in particular, many of the members of the Network for Greening the Financial System. And it's really central banks in many ways who have been taking the lead on this front and establishing good practices for disclosures, risk management, green finance, and integration into monetary policy. And so, for instance, the Bank of England evaluated their portfolio's exposure to climate risks in an award-winning disclosure report. And investors, in addition to what we're seeing on the regulatory front, investors are also increasingly expecting assessment and disclosures of climate risks and demonstrated efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so notably, Larry Fink, in his 2021 letter to CEOs, clearly underscores the fact that climate risk is investment risk. And we're seeing this type of perspective being adopted by more and more investors. Lastly, investors, banks, and corporations are also committing to ambitious emissions reductions. For example, the Net Zero Carbon Asset Owner Alliance, which includes 33 such investors with assets worth more than $4.5 trillion, are actively seeking to implement ambitious emissions cuts. In terms of U.S. regulatory development, so even in the U.S., which has tended to lag Europe on, for instance, climate risk assessment requirements, we're seeing important activity at the state level and increasingly expecting to see federal action. So, and the types of actions that we've seen fall under 4 broad umbrellas. The first is understanding exposure of insurers' climate risks. And this has entailed efforts, for instance, by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, their Climate Risk Disclosure Survey, which explores a range of climate-related issues, including mitigation, emissions and carbon footprints, financial solvency and investment. And then at the state level, the California Department of Insurance has implemented a set of more detailed surveys exploring insurers' exposure to fossil fuel invested assets. Secondly, there are increasingly calls to develop climate risk exposure management guidelines. While criteria for consideration of these climate risks have not yet been explicitly established, expectations are such that insurers manage all material risks. Their management of these risks implicitly entails coverage of climate risks. Furthermore, it's expected that the NAICS Climate and Resiliency Task Force's work will likely ultimately result in additional guidance for insurers. Third, stress tests to identify exposure and improve response. Although US insurers and regulators have a very good understanding of how to assess, manage, deal with natural catastrophes, stress tests and scenario analysis focus specifically on climate change risks. So taking account of the forward-looking risks we can expect with climate change. This is not yet widespread. Certain regulators are more advanced than others in this regard. For instance, the California Department of Insurance evaluated the exposure of California insurers' portfolios to transition risks, looking at over $4 trillion in investments. And then the last piece is more rigorous climate disclosure requirements. Publicly listed entities disclose climate risk as part of their general requirement to report relevant material risks. However, it's also expected that the SEC will ultimately move toward more specific requirements regarding climate risk disclosure. On the investor front, some of the drivers that we see underpinning their interest include the fact that asset owners, they have long-term liabilities that incentivize them to take a long-term view of risk. So for instance, large asset owners such as pension funds are forced to take a longer-term view because they have long-term liabilities as they intend to plan to pay out retirements for the next 100 years, for instance. Asset owners are also increasingly requiring asset managers to account for climate risks. And recent legal opinions and regulatory guidelines have emphasized that fiduciary duty encompasses consideration of climate risks. So although this type of perspective has not been taken up extensively in the US, and other countries such as Canada, the UK, and Sweden, they're taking steps to redefine this fiduciary duty concept. And then lastly, we're seeing more mainstreaming of climate considerations throughout investment firms. So climate is no longer siloed within the context of an ESG or sustainability focused group, and no longer just talked about, let's say, at senior or C-suite levels, but is really being incorporated into the work of portfolio managers and analysts. So when it comes to assessing physical and transition risks, there are a number of risks and opportunities it's useful to keep in mind for the insurance sector. And so first, in order to define physical risks and transition risks, physical risks relate to the impacts that we're experiencing because of a changing climate. And that includes both acute events as well as chronic. The acute events are those that basically extreme events, wildfires, floods, hurricanes, and so on, all of which basically we're experiencing currently in the US, more or less. And the chronic events are the slower, longer-term onset, longer-term impacts related to things like sea level rise and temperature increase. Transition risks are risks that are associated with as we shift away from a fossil fuel-based economy. And so when it comes to physical risks, the types of impacts that this could have on the insurance industry include things like increased claims for weather-related hazards, which could potentially require adjustment of risk assessment frameworks and inclusion of forward-looking data. So one of the key things to keep in mind is that when it comes to climate change, the CAT models are likely not going to do justice to the types of impacts that we'll experience with climate change because of their historical perspective. And so really critical to take this intentional forward-looking view and incorporate forward-looking data. Increased costs for reinsurance, for instance, as tail events become more common and severe. The affordability of insuring some areas may decrease premiums and profits. And then the rapid repricing of assets that are exposed to climate risks may have negative implications for investment portfolios. In addition to these risks, there are likely to be some opportunities on the physical risk side that may include being able to explore new markets that face hazards that have not been previously experienced and thus require new insurance offerings. On the transition risk side, with the transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy, there may be decreased feasibility of certain lines of business that cater to carbon-intensive industries. Higher litigation risks stemming from the uncertainty that's associated with an evolving regulatory landscape. Reputational impacts for insurers that continue to provide services to carbon-intensive industries as more of the world makes that shift and customer expectations change. And then businesses focused on renewable energy and other technological advancements, they potentially present a new underwriting and investment opportunities. So once again, on the transition risk side, there are opportunities in addition to the risks that they pose, that those climate risks pose. And then as far as an approach to evaluating climate risk, where we typically see our clients start is with education and awareness. So really working with internal stakeholders to socialize the impact of climate risk on financial risk and just make sure people have a baseline understanding of, yes, this is an important and relevant set of factors for the work that I do. Risk identification then is the next step and entails the identification of both physical and transition risk exposure. So better understanding what specifically is at risk and what risks are my assets subject to. Then in order to be able to quantify risk, leveraging tools like climate pathway scenarios in order to enable assessment of the impact on balance sheets from physical and transition risks, and then leveraging all the results of all this ultimately to be able to report in alignment with regulatory and TCFD requirements. And so different data inputs are required at each stage. And at the risk identification stage, for instance, you need asset-specific physical and transition risk data, as well as climate governance data that helps you not only to understand what, let's say, a company is exposed to, but how they're managing these risks and how well positioned they are to manage these going forward. On the physical risk side, there are a number of different levels at which analysis can be conducted. When it comes to real estate and real asset exposure, ideally you want to look at exposure at a very granular level. So at a level that is asset specific and enables you to differentiate, for instance, flood and sea level rise exposure, parcel to parcel, even within high risk geographies. And so I'm highlighting a snapshot here from our Climate on Demand application, but you can see that it's helpful to understand not only which hazards is your site exposed to, but what are the specific, for instance, underlying factors that are helping to drive that change for each hazard. And then at the company level, it's useful to understand not only operations risk based on your facility footprint, but also what does supply chain risk look like? What does market risk look like from a climate perspective? And really gaining that overall view of a company's exposure so that one understands not just what's operationally relevant, but also where there might be potential implications for, let's say, countries that have resource-intensive supply chains or that have markets that are highly exposed to critical weather hazards. On the market piece, you can layer these to understand what, from a market perspective, which markets are at greater risk for a given insurer. And so you can evaluate, for instance, the exposure of a set of companies based on their locations to a set of key climate hazards, or you can leverage something like our sub-sovereign scores, for instance, which evaluate exposure to climate risks at a very granular level, at the state level, county level, city level, zip code, so that you can really differentiate risk within that context as well and understand where some of your risk hotspots might be. From a physical risk management perspective, as mentioned, in addition to being able to understand that a company is exposed to climate hazards and identifying what specifically they're exposed to, ideally you want a sense of How are companies managing these risks? So what's the impact on their corporate assets? What are the potential increased costs, supply chain disruptions, operational disruptions, and how well positioned is a company to anticipate, prevent, and manage these types of impacts? On the transition risk side for commercial real estate, it's important to understand not only building level performance now, so what is their energy and carbon footprint, but how well positioned, what's the potential trajectory as we start to look at changing policies, for instance. So if we know that a certain jurisdiction has policies associated with mitigation targets, how does this particular building align with that? What types of implementation measure, what types of measures can you put in place in order to move in that direction? So in addition to, for instance, portfolio-wide energy and carbon performance assessments, being able to simulate transition risk mitigation pathways, and then estimate renovation costs so that you can meet your carbon reduction targets. At the transition risk level for companies, it's important not only to understand carbon footprints for scopes 1, 2, and 3, but also how well positioned how exposed they are from an energy transition perspective generally. So how well do they do when it comes to green products and services? What about transportation? What does their energy consumption look like? Their use and disposal of products? And understanding these elements, as well as where leadership lands, how they implement, what are their results, in order to get a view on their overall energy transition positioning is critically important. And so with that, I will wrap up. I have included my contact details on this last slide, and you are all more than welcome to reach out to me should you have any questions, and I look forward to hopefully continuing to engage with you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Government, business, and communities worldwide must prepare for market disruptions affecting our economic well-being. Today, Jodi Hanson-Bond, President, DevryBV Sustainable Strategies, will present a discussion on promoting economic resilience amidst climate disruptions. Welcome, Ms. Bond.
Hello, my name is Jodi Bond, and I am so appreciative to be a part of this climate summit. This is my second time appearing at the summit 3 years ago when I was a member of the insurance industry. And now today, again, I want to thank Commissioner Kreidler and the entire team that has put this production together. I am so grateful for his leadership. I really admire him. On the front end, I do have to say that, who better than to serve as insurance commissioner than someone who was a smoke jumper, trained to be a smoke jumper, and who understands what it's like to be a first responder in a crisis, working in our communities in the area of remediation. Next, Commissioner Kreidler also has been someone I've admired for a long time, because as the longest serving insurance commissioner in the country, he has really played a leadership role on climate issues, not only domestically, but internationally. He's really been at the forefront of these issues for such a long time. And then also as the leading advocate for the consumers in Washington State, he has such an adept understanding of the need for availability and pricing to be accurate so that the liquidity is available to the consumers to have choices. And for all those reasons, plus the fact I'm actually from Olympia, Washington, and my grandmother several decades ago worked for him. It's just an extra joy to be here, to be invited, and to be speaking. It's so clear that in the midst of climate disruptions, this is fertile ground to again be talking about social and economic resilience and what's needed. How do we deliver a quality of actions and at what cost that help our communities remain or enhance resiliency overall? And when you think about the numbers that are estimated in place, somewhere varying from 1.7 to $6 trillion of social and economic impact due to climate disruption, the numbers can become overwhelming. And yet when we're in our communities, and I think about our friends, my family, anywhere from California to Oregon to Washington State, in the midst of what's happening on climate, we really start recognizing that we have to accelerate our actions. And we do that by creating frameworks toward action and outcome. And in this, we need to develop transparent and accurate and resilient systems that create the foundation for these frameworks toward action. And I think of three areas when I think about putting together any sort of set of accelerated mapping and plans for resiliency. I myself have been at the intersection of global business and government for 3 decades now. And yet for the last 2 years, have been a part of a strategy firm that puts ESG at the center of any growth model. And my colleagues and I have been working in the space of global business, global technology, global energy, global commodities, global financial services. And we know how difficult it can be for companies to right the ship and focus in on enhanced frameworks or ESG modeling. But we also recognize that you have to start somewhere. And one prevailing question or area of concentration is, how do insurers insure themselves against the risk of taking on their customers? Do their customers have valid ESG frameworks in place to deliver commitments toward action and outcomes? And what we do, because we know that you need to meet the customer where they're at. I talked about, how do you right the ship? Well, is the ship near the port? Is the ship way out at sea? Is the ship even in the water? Do they have any ESG framework in place? And we find that that businesses tend to be in 3 different categories. Some of them are ostriches. Their heads still in the sand where climate disruption is concerned, and they could be blindsided. And we need to meet them where they're at and help them develop any type of framework toward an environmental and social and governance model that will give them some resiliency. The next category of companies that we look at are what we call needy companies. They're ones who have a basic framework of an ESG or sustainability plan as part of their reporting, but it really needs to be integrated into the broader framework of their business plan. And they need to understand the why and the outcomes that they want to achieve by enhancing their framework and their modeling. The third set of companies that we look at are the activist companies. These are the companies that whose business model was predicated upon a values-based sustainable business model. And they could be a B Corp, or they could be a company. I mean, many of them were born in Washington State, and they have this very accelerated approach to ESG because sustainability is part of their ethos. But due to economic disruptions, climate disruptions, supply chain interruptions, COVID. They need some sort of newly invigorated mapping and modeling and framework toward action that will help them with their own growth plan. And I think companies have the ability to report out, and then insurers have a better ability to guesstimate or put some predictability and transparency into the modeling of their own risk. And that's one really big area that needs to be focused in on in order for there to be enhanced resiliency in the marketplace. The second area that I would look at in terms of enhancing resiliency is that when we look at ambitious goals on carbon, when we think about the fact that we want to get to net zero by 2050, and yet in order to get there, we need a 50% reduction then in all emissions by 2030. That's 9 years to get there. The question, the outstanding question, has really been around the fact that pricing is so variable. There needs to be some sort of transparency that gives predictive modeling the opportunity to enhance the acceleration toward outcomes. And I would submit that carbon pricing is an area of predictability that has been part of the debate, but not in a real palpable way. So my colleagues and I would submit that in an industry call to action, if you will, on carbon pricing and transparency, taking some of the variability out of play and putting more predictive measures into place is a really important component of accelerating our ability to achieve ambitious goals on carbon reduction. The third and final area that I thought that I would touch on today is the fact that accelerated frameworks are really needed in order to have the type of outcomes and resiliency that we are going to need in order to have our communities and be safe and have the response systems secure and in place. And in some ways, there are a lot of different areas where cross-sharing of information is taking place, especially sometimes between NGOs and governments, or between governments and the private sector, or between private sector and the NGOs. Yet there needs to be an accelerated, almost virtuous cycle of collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, governments, and NGOs. And currently there are so many technologies, some of them are being deployed and some are not, but there is a way to put together current technologies and use this as a part of mapping through cross-sharing of information and speeding up or accelerating the way that we're cross-sharing this information with each other. And I just want to say that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has been really on top of resiliency and climate issues, and that has been a lot of the work of Commissioner Kreidler to accelerate those discussions, and yet including maybe NGOs as a piece of this virtuous cycle of information sharing and planning, again, focused on commitments, frameworks, and actions toward reporting and outcomes. And I think that we will accelerate our opportunity to create greater resiliency in the midst of the climate disruptions that are upon us and will continue to be upon us. With that, I just again wanted to thank the insurance commissioner. I want to thank Governor Inslee and all of the team that is part of this dialogue and allowing this dialogue to take place. And I hope that Commissioner Kreidler can continue to be a person who is training and developing and leading all these future leaders on this is what organizational courage model looks like. And that is something that we applaud and appreciate being a part of the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. And finally, State Representative Joe Fitzgibbon of Washington's 34th Legislative District is here to round out our speakers. Representative Fitzgibbon will discuss a new law to accelerate the state's greenhouse gas reduction efforts. The goal of that legislation is to meet net zero emissions by 2050. Welcome, Representative Fitzgibbon.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Fitzgibbon. I'm a Washington State Representative. I represent Washington's 34th Legislative District in West Seattle, White Center, Burien, and Vashon and Maury Islands. I also serve as the chair of the House Environment and Energy Committee in our Washington State Legislature. And I'm excited to be with you this morning, and I'm excited to brag a little bit about some of the work that we've done in the Washington State Legislature to position Washington as one of the nation's leading states on reducing greenhouse gases, fighting climate change, and ensuring a safe climate for current and future generations. You all know well the impacts a changing climate is having on our communities. Of course, in Washington, we experienced by far the hottest temperatures we've ever experienced here. On June 30th of this year, it reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit in Seattle, which is considerably hotter than it's ever been before. But that's not the only extreme weather event that we've experienced. We've seen devastating flooding in the southeastern and northeastern United States. We've seen increased frequency and severity of hurricanes. We, of course, have seen far more severe wildfires in the western United States, including in Washington, than ever before. And it was only just about a year ago that we experienced 2 weeks of hazardous air quality in Washington because of wildfires across Western North America and Eastern Russia. So the impacts of changing climate are not in the future, they are upon us already. And the only silver lining that I can find in that is that it has catalyzed the Washington State Legislature to take the most aggressive actions on climate change that we have ever taken in the 2021 legislative session. It's not the very beginning of our climate work. In 2019 and in 2020, we had some important climate breakthroughs. In 2019, we passed the nation's first building performance standard for large commercial buildings, requiring that they reduce their energy use to the most efficient level that they can. We adopted the nation's strongest clean electricity law at that time, requiring that all of our electricity come from non-emitting resources by 2045, with some significant benchmarks along the way, including total phase out of coal power by 2025. And carbon neutral power by 2030. In 2020, we passed some additional important steps, including strengthening Washington's greenhouse gas targets or goals to align with what current science tells us we need to achieve in order to provide for a safe climate into the future, including a goal of net zero emissions across Washington's whole emissions portfolio by 2050. We also adopted new standards requiring more electric vehicles be sold in Washington State. But in 2021 is really the biggest year that we've had yet. And I'm excited to talk to you about the landmark laws that we passed in the 2021 legislative session. First is a law that we passed significantly ratcheting down the use of hydrofluorocarbons. Hydrofluorocarbons are a gas that's one of the most powerful greenhouse gases known to man. It's primarily used in refrigeration. It has some other industrial and chemical applications as well, including as a propellant and a foam blowing agent, but the place that it's in the greatest use is in cooling systems like refrigerators and air conditioners. Washington became the second state after California to require that all air conditioners in our state, phased in by product category starting in 2023, phase out the use of these extremely powerful greenhouse gases and move to more climate safe alternatives, which do exist, but which are not fully on the market yet because we need more states to join Washington and California in requiring the transition to these safer alternatives. That builds on work that we did in 2019 when we required phasing out of these chemicals from refrigerators, particularly large commercial refrigeration systems. Also, as a part of this law, we require that operators of large cooling systems like commercial refrigerators check those systems for leaks, because those leaks are really when hydrofluorocarbons get into the atmosphere. A molecule of a hydrofluorocarbon can be as much as 10,000 times more powerful of greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and the global warming potential of that 10,000 times greater impact is heavily front-loaded in early years. So as we look for ways to reduce the immediate impacts of a changing climate, addressing short-lived climate pollutants like hydrofluorocarbons and methane needs to be a big part of how we, in the near term, avoid the severe weather events that we're seeing increasing frequency and increasing severity over the past couple of years. So that was a great step forward. Another major step forward is a law that I have been working on for many years that we've passed out of the House of Representatives several times, but not quite made it out of the Senate ever until this year. That is a low carbon fuel standard. This is a policy that's already in place in California, in Oregon, and in British Columbia. It requires the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington and in most US states, which is transportation fuels used on road, gasoline and diesel in particular, to gradually reduce their greenhouse gas output over time. And it doesn't say how, it doesn't say what technologies we're going to be replacing gasoline and diesel with, although in California and in Oregon, the most successful fuels have been things like renewable diesel produced from canola oil or soybean oil, ethanol produced from corn and from forest waste products, and electricity used to power electric vehicles. All of those technological solutions used for transportation fuel are cleaner than gasoline and diesel. They're all incrementally incentivized by this policy, which requires that the producers of fuels that are dirtier than the standard for that year, which in almost all cases is going to be producers of gasoline and diesel fuel, either clean up their fuel by mixing in alternatives that emit fewer greenhouse gases, or acquire credits from producers of those fuels. So it may be that an oil refinery can mix in more renewable fuels to the blends that they supply to fuel suppliers, or it could be that they go on the market and that they acquire credits from an electric utility or from a biofuel producer or a renewable natural gas producer. This policy has driven enormous innovation in the other jurisdictions that have it in place. It has helped to break the oil industry's monopoly over transportation fuels in those places. And it's a really critical step for us to decarbonize, again, the largest emitting sector in our state, which is on-road transportation fuels. Finally, the policy that really serves as the backstop to all of our other greenhouse gas policies is something we refer to as the Climate Commitment Act. This adopts a firm legal cap on Washington's greenhouse gas emissions. It lowers that cap over time in order to achieve Washington's greenhouse gas targets. And it requires large emitters of greenhouse gases under that cap to acquire allowances from the state for the privilege of emitting greenhouse gases into our air. That means that oil refiners, electric utilities, natural gas utilities, and large industrial manufacturers emitting large quantities of greenhouse gases need to account for the pollution that they emit into our air and need to reduce those over time. The entities that have the easiest time reducing their pollution will have a surplus of allowances that they can provide to those entities that have a hard time reducing their emissions. We know that in some sectors, technological solutions are mature and have arrived, enabling us decarbonize to produce energy in very low carbon or zero carbon ways. The electricity sector is probably the furthest along on this front. In other sectors like the industrial sector, those solutions are not necessarily as close at hand. Those sectors will be more in need of allowances into the future than sectors like electricity generation. We expect this program is going to generate a lot of dollars for the state to invest in a transition to the clean energy economy. Because of the auctioning off of those allowances, we think that that could bring in as much as $800 million to $1 billion per year by the time the program begins operation in 2023. So with these three laws, we have in place a policy to phase out the most powerful greenhouse gases known to man. We have a policy to decarbonize the most polluting sector in our state. And we have a backstop policy ensuring that Washington achieves our greenhouse gas targets by capping pollution and reducing the cap over time until we achieve net zero greenhouse gases in the year 2050. Our work is not yet done on climate change. We have much more work to do. We will continue work in the session to come to decarbonize residential buildings, which are the largest sector that we don't. Now that we have a transportation policy in place, residential buildings are now the largest sector where we don't have a policy in place. We have more work to do to integrate greenhouse gas reductions into local governments' land use plans, both in terms of requiring land use plans to reduce those emissions by channeling development into places where the infrastructure exists to support growth and where people have more ability to get around without use of a single occupancy vehicle by utilizing modes like transit and walking and biking. But integrating climate planning into land use planning also involves anticipating a changing climate. Maybe that might mean reduced development in floodplains. That might mean reduced development in areas that are prone to fires, or reducing development in places that are subject to sea level rise. This is an important way for us to reduce the risk to communities that unfortunately won't be avoided because we deferred our taking action on reducing emissions for so long. But a lot of costs can be saved by planning for those impacts and ensuring that development is taking into account those potential impacts in the future. So like I said, our work is not yet done. We will continue to push for climate smart policies in the state of Washington, but our greatest challenge today is to ensure that the great policies that we passed in 2021 are implemented successfully so that other jurisdictions around the United States and around the world will look to Washington as an example for how we can achieve greenhouse gas reductions in a smart, cost-effective way that's supportive of our economies and supportive of the communities most impacted by a changing climate. So thanks again for spending some time hearing about Washington's climate progress today. Thank you for your work helping communities adapt and anticipate the impacts that climate change is delivering to our doorstep in greater number each year. And please hope you'll continue to join me in fighting for the climate progress that we need to keep current and future generations safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Representative Fitzgibbon. And now Commissioner Kreidler would like to leave us with some parting thoughts.
As we heard from so many people today, climate change demands immediate action. This summer, Washington State experienced record-setting temperatures for days caused by a heat dome. And in the Pacific Northwest, extreme heat can lead to deaths. Estimates are in the hundreds from British Columbia to Oregon. The extreme heat was coupled with drought conditions that exacerbated wildfire risk. We got lucky with our wildfire season this year, but luck runs out and we can't get caught unprepared. I want to extend sincere thanks to all of our speakers. They covered widely varied topics and left us with some takeaways. Microsoft talked about the company's view on the difference between a promise or a pledge and actually implementing it. Rob Johnson with Climate Pledge Arena showed that with some imagination and teamwork, ambitious ideas are not out of reach if we change our expectations of what is possible. Amazon explained how the company is making grants available to use the cloud to study data related to climate change. I encourage any students and scientists They take advantage of that opportunity to provide the world with not only more data, but with actions to improve it. Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz said, scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there is hope. My hope is that all of us found at least one takeaway from Climate Summit 2021 that can galvanize action. Thank you for joining us.